Have you ever wondered where humanity first got the idea of heaven and hell, angels and demons, light battling darkness? Long before Christianity, Islam, or even Buddhism, there was an ancient Persian faith that dared to see the entire universe as a battlefield between truth and lies, purity and corruption. Zoroastrianism didn't just shape empires, it planted the very seeds of how billions of people today imagine good and evil. This is more than history. It's the story of the choices we all face, every single day. If you're ready to uncover the forgotten origins of dualism and how it still defines our world, stay with me until the end. And if you find this journey as eye-opening as I do, make sure to hit subscribe, tap the like button, and share this video so more people can rediscover the wisdom hidden in the fires of the ancient world. Cargo cults, in the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, scattered across islands that seemed untouched by the wider world, there once lived communities who had known little of the outside until one of the most disruptive events in human history, World War II, came crashing into their lives. For generations, these islanders lived with the rhythms of nature. They fished in turquoise waters, cultivated their land, and passed down traditions that shaped their understanding of the universe. Life was simple, guided by rituals and beliefs that made sense in their world. But when the war began, their islands suddenly became strategic outposts. Great powers sailed into their quiet shores and transformed them into bustling hubs of military activity. Soldiers arrived with machines unlike anything the islanders had ever seen. Cargo planes descended from the sky like massive metal birds, spilling out boxes filled with food, canned goods, radios, tools, weapons, and medicine. Ships unloaded crates with supplies beyond imagination, things that were not made by local hands, but seemed to come from somewhere beyond the horizon. For the islanders, these goods were not just practical, they were magical. Imagine never seeing a flashlight before, and suddenly one glows in the darkness. Imagine tasting canned meat when all you've ever eaten is what you catch or grow. To the eyes of these isolated communities, the soldiers and their cargo seemed divine, and the airstrips, uniforms, and strange rituals of the military looked like ceremonies that summoned abundance. But then, just as suddenly as it began, it ended. The war finished, the soldiers packed up, and the great metal birds stopped coming. The docks grew silent, the skies emptied, and the steady flow of cargo ceased. The islanders were left with fragments of memory, abandoned runways, empty crates, and the vivid recollection of abundance fall. Ling from the sky. Their world had changed forever, and they struggled to explain it. They did not understand the global economy, factories, or supply chains. They had never heard of industrial production. To them, cargo had appeared mysteriously with the presence of soldiers, and when the soldiers left, the gifts from the heavens stopped. Faced with this mystery, they sought answers in the way humans always have, through meaning, ritual, and belief. If the soldiers' actions, marching in formation, speaking into radios, lighting signal fires, waving flags, had brought the cargo, then perhaps imitating those actions would bring it back. And so the islanders began to recreate what they had seen. They cleared sandy beaches to form runways. They built imitation control towers out of wood. They carved radios from coconuts and bamboo, believing that the act of speaking into them could call down planes. Some even constructed life-size replicas of aircraft from bamboo and palm, complete with cockpits and wings. They wore uniforms fashioned from local materials, carried flags, and marched in patterns that resembled the military drills they once observed. To outsiders, these acts may look naive, but they were not acts of foolishness. They were logical attempts to solve an extraordinary problem with the knowledge available. Imagine standing in their place. One day, silver birds descend with endless supplies, then they vanish forever. How else could you interpret such wonders without understanding factories, shipping routes, and global logistics? For the islanders, it was not absurd. It was an act of hope, a way to restore what they had lost, a belief that if the rituals were faithfully performed, the sky would once again open and abundance would return. One of the most famous examples was the John Frum movement on the island of Tanna in Vanuatu. During the war, American soldiers had arrived there with enormous supplies. After the war, the figure of John Frum, perhaps a misremembered name of a soldier or a myth born from fragmented encounters, became central to their belief. Followers gathered every year on February 15th, dressing in red, marching with homemade American flags, and celebrating the hope that John Frum would return. bringing prosperity once more. To them, John was not merely a man, but a spiritual promise, a figure who symbolized a bridge to abundance. Anthropologists who studied these movements explained that the islanders were not imitating blindly. They were interpreting what they had seen, filtering it through the framework of their worldview. Human beings everywhere do the same. When confronted with something new and overwhelming, we explain it using the tools of meaning that are available to us. In Europe, centuries earlier, comets were seen as divine omens. In other places, eclipses were interpreted as battles of gods. In the Pacific, modern technology arrived overnight, and the explanation that it came from divine beings responding to ritual action was a natural one. The structures built by cargo cults often carried remarkable detail. Wooden radios had carved knobs and dials, even though they did not function. Runways were carefully maintained as if expecting planes to land at any moment. Men sat inside bamboo control towers, calling to the sky as if speaking to unseen allies. Communities worked together to build docks where ships would never arrive. These rituals were not just about receiving goods. They were also about unity. They gave the people purpose, strengthened bonds, and offered a shared hope in the face of loss and hardship. Over time, the phrase cargo cult became a metaphor beyond the Pacific. In science, business, and technology, people began using it to describe the act of copying the appearance of something successful without understanding the deeper principles that made it work. For example, a company might adopt a ritual like daily stand-up meetings simply because another company used them, without realizing what conditions made them effective. This is like building bamboo airplanes without engines, imitating the form while missing the essence. The metaphor reminds us that surface imitation without comprehension rarely brings the desired result. Today, remnants of cargo cult rituals still survive. In Tana, followers of John Frum continue to celebrate, though the gatherings now draw tourists as much as believers. Outsiders often view these practices as strange relics of a bygone era, but for the communities themselves, they remain powerful cultural traditions. They are not just about cargo anymore. They are about identity, memory, and the story of how their ancestors encountered a changing world. At its core, the story of cargo cults is not one of ignorance, but of humanity's deep need to make sense of the unknown. It is about the creativity of the human spirit when faced with mystery. The islanders did not sit idle when the skies grew silent. They built, marched, prayed, and hoped. In their own way, they confronted the vastness of modern technology with rituals that gave life meaning. And in doing so, they revealed something universal about us all. When faced with the incomprehensible, humans will always seek patterns, symbols, and stories to bridge the gap between the world we know and the mysteries we cannot yet explain. Heaven's Gate. In the 1970s, a peculiar spiritual movement began to take shape in the United States, one that would later shock the world and be remembered as one of the most unusual and tragic episodes in modern religious history. This group came to be known as Heaven's Gate, and while many today remember only the haunting news stories of its end, the movement itself was the product of decades of searching, longing, and conviction. To understand it, we have to step into the minds of its founders and followers and see how ordinary people, searching for meaning, were drawn into an extraordinary path. The story begins with two figures, Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Nettles. Applewhite, later known to his followers as Dew, was a man with a commanding presence. He spoke with clarity, passion, and conviction. Nettles, known as Ty, was a nurse with a deep interest in spiritual and metaphysical ideas. When the two met, they formed not only a personal bond, but a powerful partnership of belief. Together, they began to preach that the earth was on the verge of being recycled, a word they used to mean that the world as we know it would be destroyed and renewed. The only way to survive, they said, was to leave behind human existence and ascend to a higher level of being. This higher level was not described in vague spiritual terms. For Applewhite and Nettles, it was concrete and physical. They taught that advanced beings lived on another plane of existence, like a kingdom in space. A spacecraft, they said, would one day come to take their followers there. Unlike many religions that look to heaven as an abstract paradise, Heaven's Gate envisioned a literal journey beyond the earth, where life would continue in a purer, higher form. To reach it, however, required discipline, sacrifice, and total devotion. The group began small, but its message resonated with people at a time and many Americans were exploring alternative spiritual paths. The 1970s was an age of searching. Hippies, mystics, New Age seekers, and disillusioned youth were all looking for meaning beyond traditional institutions. Heaven's Gate attracted those who felt alienated, those who yearned for a community, and those who wanted to believe in something greater than themselves. Slowly, followers gathered, forming a community bound together by belief and practice. Life inside Heaven's Gate was strict. Members gave up their families, jobs, and personal identities. They even abandoned their names, adopting new ones that symbolized their break with the past. They dressed alike, ate simple meals, and spoke in controlled ways. Everything about the group was designed to erase individuality and prepare for what they saw as their next evolutionary step. Celibacy was enforced, as sexual desire was considered a distraction that tied people to the physical world. Their daily lives revolved around rules of behavior and thought, intended to purify them for the journey ahead. For outsiders, this discipline might look harsh or even suffocating, but to members, it felt liberating. They believed they were shedding the chaos of ordinary human existence in order to prepare themselves for something extraordinary. Every rule they followed, every identity they gave up, brought them closer to their destiny. Over time, their conviction grew deeper, especially as Applewhite's voice grew stronger after Nettles' death in 1985. He carried on their mission alone, insisting that their teachings were still true and that the time of departure was coming. By the 90s, their beliefs focused on a celestial sign, the arrival of the Hale-Bopp comet, which was visible from Earth in 97. While most people saw it as a stunning astronomical event, Applewhite told his followers that a spacecraft was hiding behind the comet, invisible to human eyes. This, he said, was the sign they had been waiting for. The spacecraft was coming to take them to the next level, but there was a condition. To board it, they had to leave their human bodies behind. To Applewhite, the human body was nothing more than a temporary vehicle. The true self was the soul, which could move on only if the vehicle was abandoned. This teaching led to the group's final and tragic act. In early 97, Applewhite became convinced that the time of departure had arrived. He and his followers carefully prepared for what they called their exit. They rented a large house in Rancho Santa Fe, California, where they would carry out their plan together. They recorded farewell videos, calmly explaining their beliefs and expressing excitement about what was to come. In these tapes, the members appear not frightened, but serene, smiling, speaking clearly, and showing no hesitation. To them, this was not suicide, it was graduation. It was the long-awaited step to a higher plane. The plan was carried out with precision. Members consumed a lethal mixture of barbiturates and alcohol, placing plastic bags over their heads to ensure the process was completed. They did this in groups, so that those still alive could help prepare the others. Each person wore the same outfit, black clothing with matching sneakers, and each was covered with a purple cloth once they had passed. The uniformity symbolized unity and readiness. They were, in their eyes, leaving Earth as one body, traveling together toward salvation. On March 26, 97, the world discovered what they had done. Authorities teared the house and found the bodies of 39 people, lying in eerie stillness. The news shocked the nation and quickly spread worldwide. The public was horrified, and many struggled to understand how educated, seemingly rational individuals could choose such an end. To outsiders, it looked like madness, but for the members of Heaven's Gate, it was the logical conclusion of everything they had believed and practiced for years. To grasp their perspective, imagine living for decades inside a community that constantly reinforced one idea. The earth is doomed, your body is temporary, and salvation waits just beyond the stars. Every doubt that arose was explained away as interference from forces trying to keep you trapped on Earth. Every act of obedience brought you closer to the promised escape. The arrival of the comet, a real physical event visible in the sky, seemed like undeniable confirmation. In that environment, leaving their bodies was not unthinkable. It was inevitable. The tragedy of Heaven's Gate is not only about its end, but about the power of belief and the influence of leadership. Applewhite's authority was absolute. To his followers, his words were not opinions, they were truth. He interpreted signs, set the rules, and shaped reality itself. When he declared that the spacecraft was coming, his followers trusted him completely. This dynamic of total loyalty, combined with isolation from the outside world, made it nearly impossible for members to step away. The story of Heaven's Gate continues to fascinate because it blends ancient themes of salvation with modern symbols of science fiction. In earlier ages, prophets spoke of heaven above the clouds. In this key, the vision of salvation was tied to spacecraft and comets. It shows how human beings use the language and imagery of their time to express spiritual longing. Where one culture sees divine chariots, another sees starships. The form changes, but the yearning remains the same. Even in its tragedy, Heaven's Gate reveals something deeply human: the desire for belonging, the hope of transcendence, and the willingness to sacrifice everything for meaning. The 39 people who died in Rancho Santa Fe were not faceless followers. They were mothers, fathers, professionals, dreamers, ordinary people who found in Heaven's Gate a story that gave their lives purpose. Their final act, while shocking to the outside world, was to them a step into the destiny they had awaited for decades. Heaven's Gate is remembered today as a cautionary tale about the dangers of extreme belief and charismatic leadership. But it is also a mirror, showing how the human search for answers can lead people to extraordinary paths. When the comet blazed across the night sky in '97, millions of people saw only a ball of ice and dust. But to the members of Heaven's Gate, it was the doorway to eternity, and with unwavering conviction, they chose to walk through it. Cult of Dionysus. In the world of ancient Greece, religion was not just a matter of temples and prayers. It was woven into every part of life: festivals, politics, family, and even the landscape itself. The gods were everywhere, shaping how people saw the world. Among them, few deities stirred the imagination as deeply as Dionysus, the god of wine, fertility, theater, and ecstatic transformation. His cult was unlike any other in Greece. It was wild, emotional, liberating, and often frightening to those who watched from the outside. To follow Dionysus was to step beyond the boundaries of ordinary life and into a realm of chaos, passion, and divine madness. Dionysus himself was a complex figure in mythology. He was often depicted as youthful, radiant, and unpredictable. He wandered across lands, teaching the art of cultivating grapes and making wine. He could bring joy and release, but also madness and destruction. In one story, he blessed a village with vines full of fruit. In another, he drove those who rejected him into a frenzy that tore their world apart. This dual nature, giver of life and bringer of madness, was at the heart of his worship. To honor Dionysus was to walk a thin line between bliss and danger. The cult of Dionysus was different from the solemn rituals of other Greek gods. While temples to Zeus or Athena often emphasized order, sacrifice, and civic duty, the followers of Dionysus sought something more direct, more personal. Their rituals aimed to dissolve the boundaries of everyday identity. Through music, dance, wine, and frenzied celebration, worshippers sought a state called ecstasis, literally meaning to stand outside oneself. In ecstasis, they felt they could break free from the roles imposed by society, farmer, wife, soldier, servant, and merge with something greater, something divine. These rituals often took place not in cities, but in the wilderness, on mountaintops, in forests, or fields under the open sky. Followers gathered at night, carrying torches, drinking wine, and moving in wild rhythmic dances. Music filled the air, drums, flutes, and chants that built into a frenzy. As the ritual intensified, worshippers lost themselves in movement, shouting the name of Dionysus, calling him into their midst. They believed that in these moments, the god himself was present, moving among them, possessing them with his energy. Women played a central role in the cult. Known as Maenads or Bacchantes, they were often shown in art wearing fawn skins, ivy wreaths, and carrying thyrsi, staffs topped with pine cones. They were the most devoted followers of Dionysus, and their ecstatic worship became legendary. To many Greek men, this was both fascinating and terrifying. In daily life, women were expected to remain at home, silent in public matters. But in Dionysian worship, they shouted, danced, and expressed themselves with wild freedom. For women, it was an intoxicating release from social restrictions. For men in power, it was a challenge to the order of society itself. Stories about the Maenads often carried an edge of fear. Ancient writers describe them as rushing through hills in a frenzy, sometimes tearing apart animals, and in extreme myths, even people, in acts known as sparagmos, symbolic dismemberments that represented death and renewal. While historians debate whether these acts truly occurred or were exaggerated by hostile observers, the symbolism was clear. Dionysus demanded surrender, a letting go of the old self so that new life could emerge. The cult was not about quiet devotion, but about transformation through intensity, sometimes to the point of destruction. Wine was at the heart of Dionysian rituals. It was not simply a drink, but a gift from the god, a way of taking him into one's body. As the wine loosened inhibitions, worshippers felt closer to Dionysus himself. But the drinking was not aimless indulgence. It was guided by chants, dances, and collective activity that gave it sacred focus. Through wine, music, and movement, the boundary between human and divine blurred. Worshippers felt themselves lifted beyond their ordinary selves, tasting immortality for a fleeting moment. The cult also had a profound connection with theater. In fact, ancient Greek drama was born out of festivals dedicated to Dionysus. Plays were not mere entertainment, they were offerings to the god. Tragedies and comedies explored themes of transformation, identity, suffering, and ecstasy, all central to Dionysian, Sinaean belief. Actors put on masks, taking on roles beyond themselves, embodying the idea that identity was fluid and changeable. For the audience, watching a play was itself a ritual, a controlled way to experience the intensity of Dionysus's power. Festivals such as the city Dionysia in Athens drew huge crowds and became cultural milestones, showing how deeply the god's worship shaped Greek society. Yet, Dionysus and his followers were not always welcomed. The cult's wildness, its challenge to order and authority, often frightened rulers. In several Greek city-states, leaders attempted to suppress Dionysian rituals, fearing that gatherings of ecstatic worshippers, especially groups of women leaving their homes, could disrupt society. This tension between control and liberation was dramatized in works like Euripides' tragedy The Bacchae, which tells the story of King Pentheus of Thebes. He tries to suppress Dionysus' cult, mocking its excess and attempting to arrest its followers. In the end, he is torn apart by Maenads in a frenzy, including his own mother. The play is a warning: resist Dionysus, and the forces of passion and chaos you deny will consume you. Despite opposition, the cult of Dionysus spread far and wide. Its appeal lay in its promise of direct experience. Traditional worship in Greece often involved priests, sacrifices, and structured rituals, but Dionysus offered something different: personal transformation, a chance to lose oneself and taste the divine directly. For those who felt constrained by society, it was freedom. For those burdened by the hardships of daily life, it was release. Imagine a young farmer, exhausted by labor and bound by social expectations. At a Dionysian festival, he drinks wine, dons a mask, joins the dance, and for a few hours feels himself part of a vast, mysterious power. That memory would stay with him long after the festival ended, a glimpse of something larger than life. The imagery of Dionysus reflected his wild, transformative nature. Grapes, ivy, and vines symbolized growth, abundance, and intoxication. Animals like leopards and bulls represented untamed power. Masks reminded followers that identity was fluid, that one could become something or someone else in worship. Art showed Dionysus surrounded by satyrs and maenads, a chaotic procession that mirrored the frenzy of his rituals. These symbols kept his presence alive in daily life, reminders of the mysteries waiting just beyond the surface of ordinary reality. The cult of Dionysus endured because it spoke to deep human needs, the need for release, for transformation, for connection to forces beyond ourselves. In a society that prized order, reason, and restraint, Dionysus offered the opposite: emotion, passion, and chaos as sacred pathways. His followers believed that by stepping outside themselves, through wine, dance, and ecstatic ritual, they could meet the god face to face. Even if only for a moment, they felt the divine madness of Dionysus flowing through them, breaking down the walls of identity and opening them to a larger truth. To this day, the legacy of Dionysus lingers. Theater, music, festivals, and even our fascination with the balance between reason and passion carry echoes of his cult. The story of Dionysus reminds us that human beings are not only creatures of order, but also creatures of emotion, longing, and transformation. The cult of Dionysus shows that sometimes, to truly live, people must let go of control, embrace chaos, and dance in the presence of the divine. Gnosticism. In the first few centuries of the Common Era, the ancient Mediterranean world was filled with spiritual searching. Greek philosophy had spread across empires, Judaism offered deep traditions, early Christianity was taking root, and countless mystery religions promised hidden truths. In this vibrant and often confusing landscape, one spiritual movement stood out for its radical ideas and its bold challenge to conventional belief. This movement was known as Gnosticism, and though it never became the dominant faith, it left a powerful legacy. It shaped how people thought about God, the world, and the human soul. Even today, echoes of Gnostic thought still stir in modern spirituality, literature, and philosophy. At its heart, Gnosticism was not a single organized religion, but a collection of movements united by a shared conviction that the physical world was not the ultimate reality, but a flawed illusion. Gnostics believed that deep within every person was a divine spark, a fragment of pure spirit that came from a higher, hidden realm of light. This spark, however, was trapped in the heavy, corrupt material world. The task of life was not simply to obey laws or follow rituals, it was to awaken, to remember one's true origin, and to return to the realm of spirit. The very word gnosis means knowledge, but not ordinary knowledge like mathematics or history. It meant secret, inner knowledge, a direct, transformative awareness of spiritual truth. To the Gnostics, salvation came not through faith alone, nor through external rituals, but through this hidden wisdom. Imagine living your whole life in a dark room, believing the shadows on the wall were reality, only to discover a hidden door leading out into the sunlit world. That moment of realization, that sudden awakening, was what Gnostics believed Gnosis offered. But why, the Gnostics asked, if there was a realm of pure spirit and goodness, did we find ourselves trapped in a world of suffering, injustice, and death? Their answer was bold and shocking. They taught that the material universe was not created by the true ultimate God, but by a lesser ignorant being known as the Demiurge. This Demiurge, they said, believed himself to be the only God and fashioned the world out of arrogance or error. Some Gnostic texts even portrayed him as malicious, a jailer who kept souls trapped in bodies. Others saw him more as a misguided craftsman, unaware of the higher reality above him. The Demiurge was often associated with the stern God of the Hebrew Bible, which immediately put Gnostics at odds with both Jews and early Christians. For them, the true hidden God was beyond this flawed creation, utterly transcendent, a source of pure light and goodness untouched by material corruption. Between this higher God and the Demiurge stretched a complex hierarchy of spiritual beings called eons, who represented aspects of divine thought and energy. Among them was Sophia, or wisdom, whose fall or mistake, according to Gnostic myth, led to the creation of the material world. Sophia's story mirrored humanity's own. Just as she had fallen from the higher realm into entanglement with matter, so too had the human soul fallen from its divine origin. But just as Sophia could be restored, so too could the human spark return to the light. Through gnosis, the soul could recognize its true home and escape the cycle of rebirth and ignorance. To understand how radical this was, consider the mainstream religions of the time. Judaism, Christianity, and even Greco-Roman religions often saw the world as purposeful, as the work of gods or God. The Gnostics, by contrast, declared the world itself a prison, a deception. Where others saw sin and forgiveness, Gnostics saw ignorance and awakening. Where others looked full or salvation through faith or law, Gnostics insisted salvation came only through inner knowledge. This view shaped their practices. Some Gnostics lived extremely ascetic lives, avoiding sex, marriage, rich food, and luxury, believing that the body and its desires were traps set by the Demiurge. By disciplining themselves, they tried to keep their divine spark untainted. Others, however, went the opposite way. If the material world was false and meaningless, then actions within it had no ultimate weight. For these groups, breaking social rules or indulging desires was a way of proving that they were not bound by the Demiurge's laws. This diversity made Gnosticism confusing to outsiders, who often misunderstood or condemned it. Central to many Gnostic texts was the figure of Jesus, but not in the way mainstream Christianity portrayed him. To the Gnostics, Jesus was not primarily the savior who died for humanity's sins. Instead, he was a bringer of gnosis, a revealer of hidden truths. He came to awaken people to the reality of their divine spark, and to show them how to escape the prison of the material world. Some Gnostic writings, like the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Philip, depict Jesus speaking in riddles, offering secret teachings only to those ready to understand. Salvation, in this view, was not about his death and resurrection, but about the wisdom he shared. Not surprisingly, this interpretation clashed with the emerging Orthodox Church, which taught that salvation came through Christ's sacrifice and faith in him. Church leaders saw Gnosticism as a dangerous threat to unity. They wrote against it fiercely, denouncing its teachings as heresy. Over time, as Christianity gained power within the Roman Empire, Gnostic groups were pushed underground. Many of their texts were destroyed, leaving much of their story to be told only by their opponents. Yet, the Gnostic voice was not completely silenced. In 1945, near the Egyptian town of Nag Hammadi, a remarkable discovery changed everything. A clay jar was unearthed containing a library of Gnostic writings, gospels, treatises, myths that had been hidden for over 100 years. Suddenly, scholars could read Gnostics in their own words. The Gospel of Thomas presented a collection of Jesus' sayings that emphasized inner awakening. The Apocryphon of John described in detail the myth of the demiurge and the higher God. These texts revealed a rich, imaginative spiritual world, one that saw the universe as layered with hidden truths. The language of these writings was often symbolic and poetic. They spoke of light and darkness, blindness and vision, ignorance and awakening. The soul was described as a traveler in a strange land, longing to return home. Gnosis was the map, the hidden knowledge that revealed the way back. These metaphors gave voice to the deep sense of alienation and yearning that many people felt in a time of political upheaval, empire, and personal uncertainty. To imagine the Gnostic worldview, think of life as being trapped inside a vast maze. Most people, unaware, settle down in a comfortable corner of the maze, decorating their walls and calling it home. But the Gnostic receives a secret map, one that shows the way out. The journey is difficult, with obstacles at every turn, but the map gives hope and direction. For the Gnostic, Gnosis was that secret map, the knowledge that pointed the soul toward freedom. Although Gnosticism declined as an organized movement, its influence lived on. Elements of its thought appeared in medieval mysticism, in esoteric traditions, and in philosophies that questioned the goodness of the material world. Even today, modern thinkers and spiritual seekers are drawn to its themes. The idea that the world may not be what it seems, that hidden truths await discovery, and that salvation lies not in external authority, but in inner awakening. Gnosticism reminds us of a timeless human longing, the desire to know who we really are, where we truly come from, and how we might return to a place of light and freedom. Whether one sees it as profound wisdom or dangerous heresy, its vision continues to challenge and inspire. It whispers that reality is deeper than appearances, that within us lies a spark of the divine, and that through awakening we might transcend the prison of the world and return to the home of the spirit. Ghost dance movement in the late 19th century, across the windswept plains and rugged mountains of North America, Native American tribes faced devastation. Their lands were taken, their buffalo herds slaughtered, their traditions suppressed, and their way of life shattered under the pressure of U.S. expansion. In just a few generations, entire nations had been forced into reservations, stripped of freedom and dignity. Yet, even in the face of despair, a spark of hope rose. A movement that promised renewal, restoration, and a return to harmony with the earth. This was the Ghost Dance movement, one of the most powerful spiritual awakenings in Native American history, a vision of resistance and survival born in a time of near annihilation. The Ghost Dance began with the visions of a Paiute man named Wovoka, also known as Jack Wilson. Born in Nevada in the mid-1800s, Wovoka lived through years of hardship. He witnessed the suffering of his people, who endured disease, hunger, and the loss of their ancestral lands. In the winter of 1889, during an eclipse, Wovoka experienced a vision that would ignite a movement. He claimed that he had been taken into the spirit world, where he saw ancestors alive and joyful, living in a world free of suffering. There, he met the Great Spirit, who gave him a message. If native people lived in peace, worked hard, and performed a sacred new ritual, the world would be transformed. This ritual was the ghost dance. It was a circle dance performed by men, women, and children, all holding hands, moving together for hours, sometimes days. As the dance grew more intense, participants often fell into trances, experiencing visions of a renewed world. They saw buffalo herds returning to the plains, their ancestors rising from the earth, and the white settlers disappearing, as if washed away by a great storm. To the native people who had seen their cult, Urus destroyed, and their families broken apart, these visions were more than dreams. They were promises of hope, delivered by the Creator himself. The ghost dance was not just a ritual, it was a spiritual revolution. It spread rapidly from tribe to tribe. The Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Shoshone, and many others adopted it. Each community infused the dance with its own traditions and hopes, but the core message remained the same. Through unity, faith, and ritual, native people could bring about renewal. For a people who had lost almost everything, this belief was a lifeline. To the U.S. government, however, the ghost dance was seen as dangerous. Officials watched as thousands gathered in large ceremonies, wearing special ghost shirts, sacred garments believed to protect the wearer from bullets. The sight of entire tribes moving together in ecstatic unity terrified soldiers and settlers alike. They misunderstood the movement as a rebellion, fearing it was the spark of a great uprising. In reality, the ghost dance was largely peaceful, a call for spiritual renewal rather than violence. But in a climate of mistrust and fear, perception mattered more than truth. The tension came to a tragic climax in 1890 at Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota. The U.S. Army surrounded a group of Lakota people who had been participating in the ghost dance. Nervous and on edge, the soldiers moved in to disarm them. A shot rang out, no one knows from where, and chaos erupted. The Army opened fire with rifles and Hotchkiss guns. By the time it was over, more than 250 Lakota men, women, and children lay dead in the snow. Wounded Knee became not just a massacre, but a symbol. The violent suppression of native hope, the crushing of a movement that dared to dream of a different future. Yet even in tragedy, the ghost dance did not vanish. Though it was driven underground, its spirit lived on. The songs, visions, and prayers of the movement continued to echo in native communities. It became a symbol of resistance, a reminder that even when facing overwhelming oppression, the human spirit can rise and dream of renewal. The ghost dance was not about defeat. It was about survival, about keeping alive the connection between people, ancestors, and the sacred earth. The imagery of the ghost dance carried profound meaning. The circle, a universal symbol of unity and eternity, represented the endless connection between past, present, and future. The ghost shirts, though tragically ineffective against bullets, embodied the belief that spiritual power could shield the people from violence. The visions of buffalo returning were not just about food, but about the restoration of balance, the return of a world in which humans and nature lived in harmony. Each element of the ritual spoke to deep cultural truths, offering hope where little remained. The movement also revealed the adaptability of native spirituality. Wovoka's teachings blended traditional Paiute beliefs with Christian elements, such as the idea of peace, resurrection, and the coming of a savior-like figure. This fusion allowed the message to resonate across tribes with different traditions, giving the ghost dance a unifying power. It showed that even under pressure, native religions could evolve, drawing strength from both old and new sources, while remaining rooted in the heart of their cultures. For many native people, the ghost dance was not just about the past, but about the future. It was a vision of what could be, a world restored, healed, and free. It was a refusal to accept the destruction of their cultures as final. In every step of the dance, they declared that they were still here, still connect into the Creator, and still hopeful for renewal. Even in the face of massacre, that message survived. Today, the ghost dance remains an enduring symbol. Native communities remember it not only as a tragedy, but also as a testament to resilience. Songs and stories of the ghost dance are still shared, keeping alive the memory of those who danced for hope. In modern times, it stands as a reminder of both the suffering inflicted on native peoples and their unbreakable spirit. The ghost dance movement teaches us something universal. When people are stripped of land, dignity, and power, they do not simply vanish. They find ways to hold on, to reimagine the world, and to seek renewal. For the Lakota, Cheyenne, Paiute, and others, the ghost dance was a sacred act of survival, a vision that their ancestors and traditions would never be erased. It was a spiritual uprising, not against people, but against despair itself. Even now, when we hear of the ghost dance, we are reminded that human beings, no matter how oppressed, continue to dream of freedom. The dance in the circle, the songs to the Creator, the visions of buffalo and ancestors, all these were ways of saying, we are not finished, we are not defeated, we will rise again. And in that, the ghost dance continues to live. Muggletonianism. In the restless years of 17th century England, religion was not a quiet matter of private belief. It was a battlefield of ideas. The Reformation had shattered the old order, the Church of England had broken from Rome, Puritans challenged kings, and countless new sects were born as people wrestled with questions of faith, authority, and salvation. In this storm of uncertainty, one of the strangest and most peculiar movements took root, carried not by armies or powerful leaders, but by two men who insisted they were the final prophets of God. This movement became known as Muggletonianism, and though it never grew into a vast religion, its ideas were so unusual and stubbornly held that it fascinated outsiders for centuries. The story begins in 1651, when a London tailor named John Reeve claimed to receive a divine commission. According to Reeve, God himself had spoken to him, declaring that he and his cousin, Lodewijk Muggleton, were chosen as the last two witnesses prophesied in the Book of Revelation. Their task was not to build a church or gather armies, but to bear final testimony to God's truth before the end of days. Shortly after making this claim, Reeve died in 1658, leaving Muggleton to carry forward the mission almost alone. From then on, the small sect took its name from him, the Muggletonians. What made the Muggletonians stand out was not simply that they claimed prophetic authority, but that their teachings were radically different from both mainstream Christianity and the many other radical sects of their day. They rejected much of the mysticism, spiritualism, and speculative philosophy that surrounded them. For the Muggletonians, the world of spirits and invisible forces was a delusion. Angels and devils, they said, were not immaterial beings floating in unseen realms. Instead, all true spiritual reality was bound up in human form. God himself, they taught, was not some infinite, invisible presence scattered through the universe. He had a body, shape, and form, like a man. To say this in 17th century England was shocking. Theologians and philosophers alike insisted on God's infinite nature, beyond human comprehension. But the Muggletonians turned this on its head. To them, God was not an incomprehensible mystery, but a being who existed in one place at a time, just like us. They argued that the idea of an infinite, omnipresent God was absurd, because infinity could never take action. Only a being with a body could speak, judge, or act. This anthropomorphic vision of God gave their faith a peculiar concreteness, one that baffled outsiders but gave followers a firm sense of certainty. Equally striking was their belief about the devil. Where other sects spoke of Satan as a fallen angel or supernatural tempter, the Muggletonians denied his independent existence altogether. Evil, they said, was not the work of some cosmic enemy, but arose within the human heart. By stripping away the fear of a literal devil, they placed responsibility directly on human beings. This rejection of spiritual warfare made them unusual among their contemporaries, many of whom were obsessed with demons and witchcraft. Another hallmark of the movement was its fierce opposition to reason and philosophy in matters of faith. The Muggletonians distrusted intellectual speculation, seeing it as the source of pride and confusion. To them, salvation came not through study or debate, but through the testimony of the prophets, that is, through Muggleton's own words. They wrote and circulated pamphlets condemning philosophers, scientists, and religious thinkers alike. In their eyes, those who exalted reason above revelation were rebels against God. This put them at odds not only with established churches, but also with radical thinkers of their age who were exploring new sciences and philosophies. The Muggletonians also rejected the use of violence in religion. Unlike many sects that sought political power or used force to defend their beliefs, they insisted that faith must never be spread by the sword. This was an unusual stance in a century torn apart by civil wars fought over religion. They held their meetings quietly, often in private houses or small gatherings, avoiding the grandiosity of churches or public displays. Their worship was simple: reading, discussion, and the singing of hymns. No sacraments, no clergy, no elaborate rituals, just words and conviction. Perhaps the most curious aspect of Muggletonianism was their belief in the authority to curse and bless. Muggleton claimed that as one of the last witnesses of God, he had the power to pronounce eternal judgment on individuals. If he declared someone damned, that person's soul was lost forever. If he blessed them, they were assured of salvation. These judgments were not symbolic. They were believed to carry real eternal weight. This power made Muggleton both feared and ridiculed, for he often used it against opponents in pamphlet wars. To be cursed by Muggleton was considered a terrible fate, though for many outsiders it was little more than an oddity. Over the centuries, the Muggletonians remained a tiny sect, often numbering only a few hundred members at most. They had no ambition to convert the world, since they believed their mission was simply to bear witness. They distrusted evangelism and saw themselves as a chosen remnant, a small group entrusted with the final truth. Because of this, they lived quietly, scattered in towns and cities, bound together by shared belief rather than public structures. Their meetings were social as much as religious, and their sense of community helped them endure long after most would have expected. What is remarkable is how long the sect lasted, despite its smig. All-size Muggletonianism survived from the 17th century all the way into the 20th century. Generations passed down their writings and hymns, preserving the teachings even as the world around them changed dramatically. By the 1800s, many outsiders saw them as little more than a curiosity, a religious oddity from a bygone age. Yet the Muggletonians themselves carried on with quiet faithfulness. Their refusal to conform to larger religious trends gave them an air of stubborn resilience. In 1979, the last known Muggletonian died, and with him, the movement finally came to an end. But for over 3 centuries, this unlikely faith endured, holding fast to its strange vision of God, humanity, and destiny. Scholars today look back on them not as a great religious power, but as a window into the incredible diversity of belief that flourished in times of upheaval. Muggletonianism may sound bizarre to modern ears, but it reflects a universal truth. In moments of crisis and uncertainty, people search for new ways to understand the divine. They look for voices that cut through confusion and offer certainty. For the followers of Ludwig Muggleton, that certainty was found in the idea of a God with a body, a world without devils, and a final testimony that gave meaning to their lives. What makes their story compelling is not the size of their following, but the depth of their conviction. They were tailors, laborers, ordinary men and women who believed they held the final truth of the universe. Against ridicule, suppression, and obscurity, they endured for centuries. And in their endurance, they remind us that human beings will cling fiercely to beliefs that give life shape and certainty, no matter how strange they may seem to the rest of the world. Millerism. In the first half of the 19th century, America was alive with religious energy. Revival meetings swept across the countryside, preachers filled tents and churches, and people were gripped by the idea that God was working directly in their lives. This was the age of the Second Great Awakening, a time when faith was not distant ritual, but immediate, urgent, and passionate. Out of this fiery landscape emerged one of the most remarkable and dramatic religious movements of the era, a movement that convinced tens of thousands that the world was on the brink of its end. This was the story of Millerism, a movement led by a quiet farmer-turned-preacher named William Miller, whose message of Christ's imminent return would shake the nation and echo long after his death. William Miller was not born a prophet. He was, in many ways, an ordinary man. Born in 1782 in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, he grew up on a farm, worked hard, and lived the life of a New Englander of his time. For a while, he embraced rationalist, deist ideas, doubting traditional Christianity. But after serving in the War of 1812, where he survived battles against the odds, Miller began to feel that perhaps God was real after all, that divine providence had spared him. This experience led him back to the Bible, and he began reading it with obsessive devotion. Unlike many who relied on priests or scholars, Miller studied the scriptures for himself. He approached the Bible as if it were a puzzle to be solved, every prophecy connected, every number significant. His method was simple: interpret the Bible literally unless it was obviously symbolic. As he read, one prophecy seized his attention, the book of Daniel, especially Daniel 8:14, which spoke of 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. To most readers, this was a mysterious verse. To Miller, it was a coded message about the end of the world. Miller believed that in prophecy, days often symbolized years. If so, then the 2,300 days meant 2,300 years. Beginning from what he calculated as the starting point of the prophecy, 457 BCE, the decree to rebuild Jerusalem, he concluded that the end of the 2,300 years would fall sometime between 1843 and 1840. To Miller, this meant something staggering. Jesus Christ was about to return to earth. The second coming was not a distant hope, but an imminent reality, just around the corner. At first, Miller hesitated to share his conclusions. He was a humble man, not eager to stir controversy. But friends urged him to speak, and in 1831 he gave his first public sermon. The response was electric. His simple, earnest preaching and careful use of scripture convinced listeners that he had uncovered a divine secret. Soon, Miller's message spread beyond his local area. Newspapers began publishing his lectures, and his ideas reached audiences across the United States. By the 1830s and 1840s, Millerism had become a full-fledged movement. Preachers who believed in his message, known as Millerites, traveled widely, spreading the word that Christ was coming soon. Camp meetings drew thousands. Pamphlets, charts, and books circulated, showing the timelines and calculations that pointed to the end. For many, the message was thrilling. Life was hard in 19th century America. Economic depressions, epidemics, and political tensions weighed heavily on people. The promise that Christ would return to wipe away suffering and establish justice was irresistible. But as the year 1843 passed without the second coming, questions arose. Miller and his followers recalculated, setting new dates within 1840. The sense of urgency only increased. At last, many fixed their hope on October 22, 1844. That day, they believed, Christ would descend in glory, the dead would rise, and the faithful would be gathered into the kingdom of heaven. When October 22 arrived, Millerites gathered in churches, fields, and homes. They sang hymns, prayed fervently, and watched the skies, waiting for the trumpet sound. But the hours passed, the sun set, and nothing happened. Midnight came, and the world remained unchanged. The crushing disappointment that followed became known as the Great Disappointment. For many, the experience was devastating. Families who had given away possessions found themselves destitute. Neighbors mocked those who had believed. Some abandoned faith altogether, feeling betrayed. Others returned to their former churches in shame, but not everyone gave up. Some insisted that Miller's calculations had been correct, but the event had been misunderstood. They argued that October 20 was not the date of Christ's visible return, but the beginning of a new heavenly phase of his work. This reinterpretation eventually gave rise to new religious movements, most notably the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which continues to this day with millions of followers worldwide. Miller himself was heartbroken by the failure. He admitted his mistake, but never lost faith that Christ would come soon. He died in 1849, still believing that the end was near. His humility, his willingness to confess his error, left many respecting him, even if they no longer believed in his message. The story of Millerism is more than just a failed prophecy. It reveals something profound about the human spirit. People long for hope, especially in times of uncertainty. They yearn for, meaning for assurance that their struggles are not in vain. For the Millerites, the promise of Christ's imminent return gave them strength, community, and purpose. Even when the prophecy failed, the longing that had fueled the movement did not disappear. It transformed, giving birth to new expressions of faith. Millerism also reminds us of the power of conviction. A single farmer with a Bible and a conviction shook an entire nation, reaching tens of thousands without wealth or political power. His sincerity and clarity carried more weight than institutions or authorities. And though his dates proved wrong, the spiritual hunger he tapped into was real and lasting. In the end, Millerism was not just about a miscalculated prophecy. It was about the hope of renewal, the dream of a better world, and the belief that history has meaning. For the Millerites, waiting for Christ was not wasted time. It was a declaration of faith in the face of despair. The Great Disappointment may have broken many hearts, but from its ashes rose new movements that continued to shape religious life for generations. Even today, the legacy of Millerism lingers. It is a cautionary tale about the dangers of date setting, but also a testament to the resilience of faith. It shows us that while human predictions may fail, the longing for redemption never dies. The story of Millerism is, at its core, the story of people daring to hope that the end of sorrow was near, and that in a moment, the heavens would open, and eternity would begin. Ras Tafari Movement, Rastafarianism. In the early decades of the 20th century, across the Atlantic Ocean and the Caribbean, a new spiritual and cultural movement was born. It began in Jamaica, among communities shaped by the scars of slavery, colonialism, and poverty. Out of hardship came a vision of hope, dignity, and liberation. This vision grew into what we now know as the Ras Tafari Movement, or Rastafarianism. Though outsiders often associate it with reggae music, dreadlocks, or cannabis use, at its heart, Rastafarianism is far deeper, a living faith, a philosophy of resistance, and a declaration of identity. It is the story of people reclaiming their heritage and insisting that they were not defined by oppression, but by a spiritual destiny rooted in Africa. The movement takes its name from Ras Tafari Makonnen, the birth name of the man who became Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia in 1930. To understand why his coronation was so electrifying to Jamaicans, we must remember the context. For centuries, Africans in the Caribbean had been enslaved, stripped of language, culture, and roots. Even after emancipation, colonial rule left them marginalized and impoverished. Yet, within these communities, the dream of Africa remained alive. The idea that one day, descendants of slaves would return to the land of their ancestors, free from bondage and humiliation. When Haile Selassie was crowned Emperor of Ethiopia, the news resonated like thunder. Here was a black king, ruling an ancient African nation that had resisted colonization. Ethiopia had long held symbolic power as one of the only nations in Africa never fully conquered by European empires. For Jamaicans steeped in biblical imagery, Selassie's rise seemed like prophecy fulfilled. Many connected it with Marcus Garvey, the great Jamaican activist who had earlier declared, "Look to Africa when a black king shall be crowned, for the day of deliverance is at hand." Garvey never identified Selassie directly, but to many, the coincidence was undeniable. They believed this was the sign they had been waiting for. Thus, followers began to proclaim Haile Selassie as a divine figure. Some saw him as the earthly incarnation of God, others as the Messiah who would lead people of African descent to freedom. This belief became the cornerstone of the Ras Tafari movement. Selassie himself never claimed divinity, and in fact remained a devout Christian, but to his followers abroad, his very existence as a powerful black leader was proof that God had not forgotten them. Rastafarianism was never just about worshiping Selassie, it was about resisting Babylon. In Rastafarian thought, Babylon is not just the biblical city, but a symbol for the oppressive systems of colonialism, racism, and corruption. It represents the forces that enslaved Africans and continue to exploit them. By contrast, Zion represents Ethiopia and, more broadly, Africa itself, the spiritual homeland, a place of justice and peace. To be a Rastafarian is to reject Babylon's lies and corruption, and to live in pursuit of Zion's truth. This rejection shaped Rastafarian lifestyle. Many Rastas grew their hair into dreadlocks, inspired by the Nazirite vow in the Bible, which forbade cutting one's hair. Dreadlocks became a symbol of natural living, resistance to Babylon's norms, and spiritual strength. The locks, resembling a lion's mane, also honored the Lion of Judah, a title associated with Haile Selassie and with Christ himself. Diet, too, became a spiritual act. Many Rastafarians follow an Atale diet, avoiding processed foods, meat, and artificial chemicals. The goal is to live in harmony with nature, keeping the body pure as a vessel for the divine spark within. This emphasis on natural living reflects a broader Rastafarian belief that true freedom and dignity come from reconnecting with the earth, away from the industrialized systems of Babylon. Another highly visible aspect of Rastafarian culture is the sacramental use of ganja, or cannabis. To outsiders, this has often been misunderstood as mere recreation, but within Rastafarian practice, ganja is considered a holy herb, a gift from God to aid meditation and prayer. Smoking it in communal gatherings, known as reasoning sessions, helps open the mind, deepen spiritual reflection, and foster unity. In these circles, Rastas discuss scripture, philosophy, and visions of liberation, using the herb not to escape reality, but to confront it with clarity. Music became one of the most powerful channels for spreading Rastafarian ideas. In the mid-20th century, reggae music, especially through the voice of Bob Marley, carried the message of Rastafarianism far beyond Jamaica. Songs like Exodus, Redemption Song, and Get Up, Stand Up became anthems of resistance and hope, blending biblical imagery with calls for justice. Marley, himself a devout Rastafarian, gave voice to the movement's spiritual and political yearnings. Through music, the Rastafarian message of dignity, liberation, and divine identity reached millions worldwide, making the faith a global cultural force. The symbolism of Rastafarianism is rich and deeply rooted in both the Bible and African identity. The colors red, gold, and green, borrowed from the Ethiopian flag, represent blood, wealth, and the land, while black represents the people themselves. The lion, as mentioned, symbolizes strength, courage, and the lineage of Judah. The idea of I and I, a central phrase in Rastafarian language, reflects the belief that God, Jah, dwells within every person, erasing separation between the divine and humanity. To say I and I instead of you and I is to affirm unity, shared divinity, and oneness with Jah. Despite its spiritual depth, Rastafarianism has often been misunderstood, misrepresented, or ridiculed by outsiders. In its early years, Jamaican authorities viewed Rastas with suspicion, labeling them as dangerous radicals. Police raided their gatherings, cut their dreadlocks, and persecuted them. Yet the movement endured, its resilience a testament to the strength of its vision. Over time, as reggae spread globally and the world grew more curious about Rasta philosophy, respect for the movement grew. What was once mocked as fringe became recognized as a powerful voice for justice and identity. Haile Selassie himself visited Jamaica in 1906, and the moment was electrifying. Thousands of Rastafarians gathered to see him, many in tears, believing prophecy had come full circle. Though Selassie did not explicitly endorse their theology, his presence confirmed their faith. To this day, debates continue within Rastafarian circles about how to interpret his role, whether as God incarnate, a prophet, or a symbol of African pride. But whatever the interpretation, his coronation remains the spark that ignited the movement. Rastafarianism is not a centralized religion with formal institutions. It is diverse, with different mansions or branches, such as the Nyabingi order, the Bobo Ashanti, and the 12 tribes of Israel, each with its own emphases and practices. This diversity reflects the movement's organic grassroots nature. It is less about rigid dogma and more about lived philosophy, how one resists Babylon, honors Jah, and strives toward Zion. Today, Rastafarianism continues to thrive, not only in Jamaica, but across the world. From Africa to Europe, from the Americas to Asia, people have embraced its call for justice, equality, and spiritual awakening. It remains a faith of the marginalized, a voice that insists that liberation is both a spiritual and political reality. Its legacy can be seen in music, art, social movements, and the enduring pride of people who declare their identity in the face of oppression. The Ras Tafari movement reminds us that faith is not always about waiting for heaven after death. It can also be about reclaiming dignity here and now. For Jamaicans living under colonial rule, it was a way of saying, we are not defeated, we are chosen, we are divine. For millions worldwide, it continues to be a message of freedom, identity, and hope. At its heart, Rastafarianism is a story of survival, the survival of spirit against the crushing weight of history. It is a song of resilience, rising from the plantations of slavery to the stages of the world, carrying with it the dream of Zion, the cry against Babylon, and the affirmation that Jah lives within us all. Thuggee Cult. In the shadows of India's long history, among bustling roads and sacred temples, there once existed a brotherhood that terrified travelers and baffled authorities for centuries. They were not warriors on battlefields, nor common thieves snatching coins. They were secretive, highly organized, and devoted to a deadly ritual that blended faith, deception, and murder. This was the Thuggee Cult, a group whose name gave rise to the very word thug, still used today to mean criminal or violent person. Yet behind the stereotype lies a deeper, stranger story, one of religion, ritual, and fear woven into the fabric of Indian society. The Thuggees were not an ordinary gang. They believed their acts of killing were not mere crimes, but sacred duties performed in honor of the goddess Kali, the fierce mother goddess of destruction and renewal. To them, murder was not greed or malice, it was ritual sacrifice. The Thuggees considered themselves servants of Kali, chosen to carry out her divine will by removing travelers from the world in carefully orchestrated ceremonies of death. Each act was both worship and service, a grim offering to their goddess. The cult's method was chilling in its precision. Traveling along the trade routes of India, the Thuggees would pose as friendly companions. They blended in with merchants, pilgrims, and wanderers, gaining trust through charm, stories, and shared meals. They were masters of disguise and patience. Sometimes they traveled with unsuspecting victims for days, even weeks, before striking. When the moment came, it was swift and silent. The favored method was strangulation, using a cloth known as a rumal. One thug would distract the victim, another would loop the rumal around the neck, and within seconds the deed was done. The body would then be buried or hidden, often with rituals to complete the sacrifice. Unlike ordinary robbers, the Thuggees followed strict codes. They did not kill indiscriminately. Women, certain castes, and specific groups were often spared according to their rules. They worked in bands, sometimes dozens strong, with hierarchies and roles assigned. Some scouted, some distracted, some strangled, and others disposed of bodies. Their discipline gave them an air of dark professionalism, a system passed down through generations. Fathers initiated sons, and stories of successful kills became part of their lore. For centuries, the Thuggees thrived in secrecy. India's vastness, with its countless roads and forests, allowed them to operate undetected. Their victims, merchants, travelers, pilgrims, often vanished without trace, their disappearances dismissed as accidents or misfortunes. Locals whispered of mysterious bands who roamed the highways, but few dared confront them. To many villagers, the Thuggees were almost supernatural, servants of a goddess whose wrath no one wished to invite. It was not until the arrival of British colonial rule in the 18th and 19th centuries that the Thuggees were systematically confronted. As the British sought to secure trade routes and impose law, reports of missing travelers and strange murders reached their ears. At first, the accounts seemed unbelievable. Bands of ritual killers worshipping a goddess. It sounded like myth. But as more evidence piled up, British officers realized they faced a hidden network of terrifying scope. The campaign to eliminate the Thuggees became one of the most famous policing efforts of the era. Leading the charge was Captain William Sleeman, an officer of the British East India Company. Through intelligence, infiltration, and persistence, Sleeman uncovered the organization's methods. He relied heavily on captured Thuggees who turned informers, revealing their codes, rituals, and networks. These confessions painted a shocking picture. Thousands of murders carried out over centuries, hidden in plain sight under the cover of religion and tradition. Sleeman and his teams tracked down bands of Thuggees across India, arresting thousands. Some were executed, others imprisoned, and many transported far from their homes. By the mid-19th century, the cult had been largely broken, its power shattered. The British declared victory, presenting themselves as saviors who had rid India of a dark menace. Yet the story of the Thuggees is more complicated than colonial triumph. Some modern historians argue that British accounts exaggerated the cult's scale, painting it as more sinister to justify their own rule. The image of India as a land plagued by mysterious killers fit the colonial narrative of a civilization needing British control. Still, there is no doubt that bands of ritual murderers existed, that they followed codes tied to Kali worship, and that they terrified travelers for centuries. The exact numbers may be debated, but the reality of their existence is undeniable. The mythology surrounding the Thuggees only grew after their suppression. Novels, plays, and later films portrayed them as sinister fanatics lurking in shadows, waiting to strangle unsuspecting travelers. In British imagination, they became symbols of India's supposed barbarism. In Indian memory, they were both feared criminals and, in some ways, figures of twisted devotion. Their legacy lingered not only in stories but in language. To this day, the word thug carries echoes of their name, even though its meaning has shifted to describe common criminals rather than ritualistic bands. What makes the Thuggees so fascinating is the blend of faith and crime, devotion and violence. To them, strangling a victim was not murder but sacrifice, part of the eternal cycle of destruction and renewal governed by Kali. They saw themselves as instruments of cosmic balance, removing lives as offerings to the goddess. To outsiders, it was pure horror. This clash of perspectives, sacred duty versus brutal crime, makes their story one of the strangest in religious history. The Thuggee cult also forces us to think about how belief shapes behavior. For generations, men joined this brotherhood, convinced that their acts served a divine purpose. They were not driven only by greed, though plunder was part of it, but by the conviction that killing was worship. This belief bound them together, gave them identity, and justified deeds that otherwise would have seemed unthinkable. It shows how religion, when twisted, can turn acts of violence into sacred rituals. By the time the Thuggees were suppressed, their shadow had stretched across centuries. They left behind stories that blurred the line between history and legend. Some saw them as fanatics, others as criminals, and still others as exaggerated inventions of colonial imagination. The truth likely lies in between, real bands of ritual killers whose story was amplified by those who destroyed them. Today, the tale of the Thuggees serves as a reminder of the dark complexities of faith and power. It is a story of how belief can be harnessed to justify violence, how secrecy can sustain terror, and how myth can magnify reality. Whether seen as ruthless criminals or misguided devotees, the Thuggees remain one of history's most haunting cults, a brotherhood whose name still lingers in our language, a ghost from the roads of India that whispers of a past where faith and fear walked hand in hand. Apocalyptic Anabaptists of Münster, in the turbulent landscape of 16th century Europe, faith was not just a matter of prayer or Sunday worship. It was the engine driving wars, revolts, and visions of a new world. The Protestant Reformation had cracked the authority of the Catholic Church, unleashing a flood of radical movements, each claiming to hold the true interpretation of God's will. Among these groups, few were as dramatic or as catastrophic as the apocalyptic Anabaptists of Münster. For a brief and fiery moment, the German city of Münster became the stage for one of the most extraordinary and violent experiments in religious history, an attempt to build the New Jerusalem on earth. The seeds of this movement were planted with the rise of Anabaptism, a radical branch of the Reformation. Unlike Lutherans or Calvinists, who still baptized infants, the Anabaptists insisted that baptism should be reserved for adults who consciously chose faith. This belief set them apart and marked them as dangerous in the eyes of both Catholic and Protestant authorities. To rulers, Anabaptists were subversives, undermining the unity of church and state. To themselves, they were reformers restoring the true faith of the apostles. In the early 1530s, Münster, a city in Westphalia, became fertile ground for Anabaptist zeal. Discontent simmered among its citizens, who were weary of corruption and inequality. Preachers spread apocalyptic visions, declaring that the end of the world was near, and that Münster was destined to become the New Jerusalem, the holy city foretold in the Book of Revelation. For the faithful, this was no metaphor. It was a literal promise. God, they believed, had chosen their city to be the center of a new age. The movement gained momentum under leaders like Jan Matthys, a fiery Dutch baker who proclaimed himself a prophet. Matthys declared that the day of judgment as at hand, that Christ would return imminently, and that Münster would be the gathering place of the elect. With charismatic preaching, he inspired followers to abandon their possessions, join the community, and prepare for the apocalypse. People streamed into Münster, swelling its population, convinced that they were stepping into God's final plan. When Matthys arrived in the city in 1534, he wasted no time in transforming it. Catholic masses were banned, Protestant ministers driven out, and the city was remade according to Anabaptist principles. Baptism for adults became mandatory, and property was declared communal. The wealthy were stripped of their goods, which were redistributed to support the faithful. The city became a radical experiment in shared ownership, religious discipline, and apocalyptic fervor. But this was only the beginning. Matthies preached that God would soon strike down the wicked in a fiery judgment. He claimed that Münster would withstand all enemies, protected by divine power. His certainty led to tragedy. In April 1534, convinced that God had commanded him to personally destroy the besieging forces outside the city walls, Matthies rode out with only a few followers. He was quickly surrounded and killed, his head placed on a pike by the enemy army. His death could have shattered the movement, but instead, it gave rise to an even more extreme leader. That leader was Jan van Leyden, Matthies' disciple, who seized control of Münster after his master's death. Young, charismatic, and ruthless, van Leyden declared himself the King of the New Jerusalem. He instituted a theocratic monarchy, ruling with absolute authority. Under his leadership, the city grew even more radical. Believing they were living in the final days, van Leyden enforced strict moral codes, claiming every decision was guided by God. One of the most shocking changes was the introduction of polygamy. Justified by Old Testament examples, van Leyden declared that men could take multiple wives. He himself took dozens, including the widow of Matthies. Women were pressured or forced into these marriages, leading to deep unrest within the city. Those who resisted his rule faced brutal punishment. Executions, torture, and terror became tools of control. The dream of the New Jerusalem began to look more like a nightmare. Meanwhile, Münster was under siege. Both Catholic and Protestant forces united against the radical city, surrounding it with armies and cutting off supplies. Inside, hunger and desperation grew. Yet van Leyden maintained that deliverance was near. He staged dramatic displays to keep faith alive, holding court in royal robes, declaring visions, and assuring the people that angels would rescue them. For many, fear and devotion blurred together, binding them to his rule even as conditions worsened. The siege dragged on for over a year. Starvation gnawed at the city. Resistance became increasingly desperate. In June 1535, betrayal from within allowed enemy forces to break through the walls. The fall of Münster was swift and brutal. The dream of the New Jerusalem collapsed in fire and blood. Van Leyden and his closest lieutenants were captured, tortured, and executed in public. To make an example of them, their bodies were displayed in iron cages hung from the steeple of St. Lambert's Church, cages that remain there to this day as a grim reminder of the failed experiment. The story of the apocalyptic Anabaptists of Münster shocked Europe. To authorities, it was proof of the dangers of radical religion, of allowing zealots to overturn order in the name of faith. To many Protestants, it was a warning against excess, a sign that not all reform movements led to truth. To Catholics, it was evidence that the breaking from the church bred chaos. The name of Münster became synonymous with fanaticism and folly, a cautionary tale repeated for centuries. Yet behind the horror lies a deeper human story. The people who flocked to Münster were not monsters but men and women longing for hope. They lived in an age of upheaval. Plagues, wars, and corruption eroded trust in institutions. The promise that God would soon bring justice and renewal was irresistible. In the vision of the New Jerusalem, they found dignity, belonging, and purpose. Even when the dream turned into nightmare, the original spark was the same one that drives countless movements, the yearning for a better world. The tragedy of Münster shows how apocalyptic hope can inspire both courage and catastrophe. It can unite the oppressed, challenge the powerful, and spark revolutions. But when fused with absolute power and unchecked authority, it can spiral into tyranny. Van Leyden's city reminds us of the peril when leaders claim divine sanction for every act, silencing dissent and demanding obedience in the name of salvation. Though the movement was crushed, the broader Anabaptist tradition survived. Many Anabaptists rejected the extremism of Münster and emphasized peace, community, and simplicity. Out of their legacy grew groups like the Mennonites, Amish, and Hutterites, who carried forward Anabaptist ideals in very different, peaceful ways. In this sense, Münster stands not only as a warning, but as a contrast, showing both the heights of religious hope and the depths of its misuse. The cages still hanging in Münster are more than relics. They are symbols of a dream gone wrong, of faith twisted into fanaticism, and of the thin line between hope and horror. The apocalyptic Anabaptists of Münster remind us that when desperation meets vision, people can risk everything to build a new world. Sometimes they succeed in Krieg's Sorries, aiding communities of peace and justice. But sometimes, as in Münster, the dream burns too brightly and consumes itself in fire. Shakers. In the history of American religion, few groups have captured the imagination quite like the Shakers. To some, they are remembered as peaceful visionaries who built beautiful furniture and sang haunting hymns. To others, they were strict celibates whose way of life doomed their future. Yet beyond the stereotypes lies a remarkable story, a story of faith, discipline, and creativity that turned a small band of English dissenters into one of the most influential communal movements in America. The origins of the Shakers go back to 18th century England, during a time of social unrest and religious searching. Amid the turmoil, a woman named Anne Lee, the daughter of a blacksmith, emerged as a spiritual leader. Anne Lee had endured deep personal suffering. She lost several children in infancy, and this grief shaped her spiritual vision. She became convinced that sexual desire was the root of human sin, and that true holiness required complete celibacy. In her eyes, the fall of Adam and Eve was not about eating forbidden fruit, but about succumbing to lust. To be restored to God, humanity had to renounce sexual relations altogether. Lee joined a small dissenting group known as the Shaking Quakers, so called because of their ecstatic worship practices, which included trembling, shouting, and dancing under the influence of the Spirit. Eventually, she rose to lead the movement. Her followers came to see her not just as a prophet, but as the female embodiment of Christ, the counterpart to Jesus, who represented the male side of God. In this radical vision, God was both father and mother, and Anne Lee was the vessel of divine motherhood on earth. In 1774, seeking religious freedom, Anne Lee and a small group of followers sailed to America. They settled near Albany, New York, and began spreading their message. At first, they faced hostility. Locals mocked their strange dances and sitai. Shaker worship was another hallmark of their identity. Services were filled with ecstatic movement, singing, dancing, clapping, and shaking, which symbolized the purging of sin and the presence of the Spirit. Though outsiders sometimes mocked these displays, for Shakers, they were profound spiritual experiences. Music flowed naturally in their worship, giving rise to thousands of songs, many composed spontaneously. The most famous, Simple Gifts, has endured for centuries as a haunting expression of their values: simplicity, humility, and joy in God's will. Creativity was central to Shaker life. Their furniture, tools, and buildings became renowned for their craftsmanship. Every object was made with care, not to impress, but to serve. Shaker furniture was elegant in its simplicity, straight lines, balanced proportions, and practical design. Beauty rests on utility, they believed, and this philosophy influenced American design long after the movement declined. Their inventions were equally remarkable. The Shakers developed labor-saving devices such as the circular saw, flat broom, and even early washing machines. For them, innovation was not worldly ambition, but an expression of divine order. Yet for all their strengths, the Shakers faced a central challenge: celibacy. Unlike other communities, they did not grow through families, but only through converts. In the early years, this was not a major problem, as revival movements in the early 19th century sent waves of seekers into their villages. At their height, in the mid-1800s, the Shakers had around 6,000 members spread across more than a dozen communities in the United States. Their villages dotted New England, the Midwest, and even Kentucky, becoming thriving centers of communal life. But over time, the tide turned. As the religious fervor of the 19th century waned, fewer people were willing to renounce marriage and family. Mithraism, in the bustling cities and distant outposts of the Roman Empire, soldiers, merchants, and officials once gathered in hidden chambers beneath the earth. There, by torchlight, they performed sacred rites, shared secret meals, and swore bonds of loyalty that bound them closer than blood. This mysterious faith was known as Mithraism, or the mysteries of Mithras, and for nearly 3 centuries, it was one of the most influential religious movements of the empire. Though eventually eclipsed by Christianity, it left behind a fascinating legacy of symbols, rituals, and secrets that continue to puzzle historians today. The roots of Mithraism lie in Persia, where the god Mithra was long worshipped as a deity of light, truth, and contracts. In ancient Zoroastrianism, Mithra was a guardian of order, ensuring that promises were kept and cosmic balance upheld. When Persian culture mingled with Greek and Roman traditions, Mithra's figure evolved, blending Eastern and Western ideas into something new. By the 1st century CE, the Roman Mithras had become a unique deity, distinct from his Persian namesake, and the center of a secret cult that spread rapidly through the empire. At the heart of Mithraism was a powerful image, Mithras slaying the bull. Known as the Tauroctony, this scene was carved into countless reliefs and statues in Mithraic temples. Mithras is shown grasping a great bull, plunging his dagger into its side while animals, like a dog, a serpent, and a scorpion, gather to feed on the blood. From the bull's body, life is said to spring forth, plants, animals, and the cycle of fertility itself. The Tauroctony was not just a picture, but a myth made visible. The death of the bull brought renewal to the world, a sacrifice that sustained the universe. The temples of Mithras, called Mithraea, were hidden sanctuaries often built underground or in caves. They were long, nar. One of the central themes of Mithraism was the struggle between light and darkness. Mithras, as a solar deity linked to the sun, God's Sol Invictus, was seen as the champion of light, order, and truth. His followers believed they were part of a cosmic battle, fighting alongside him against forces of chaos. For soldiers stationed in remote outposts, far from home and surrounded by uncertainty, this vision of divine struggle gave purpose and meaning. They were not merely serving Rome, they were serving the cosmos itself. The astrological symbolism of Mithraism was also profound. The Tauroctony itself has been interpreted as a star map, with the bull representing Taurus, the scorpion representing Scorpio, and other animals linked to constellations. The 7 grades of initiation corresponded to the 7 classical planets. In this way, Mithraism tied human life to the stars, offering its initiates a cosmic identity. To be a follower of Mithras was to participate in the order of the heavens, transcending the small struggles of earthly existence. For centuries, Mithraism thrived alongside other Roman religions. It did not demand exclusivity, so men could participate in civic cults and still attend Mithraic rituals. But its secrecy and male-only membership gave it a distinctive character. It was not for everyone. It was for the chosen few, those willing to undergo the trials of initiation and share the bond of brotherhood. By the 3rd century CE, Mithraism had spread across the empire, from underground temples in Rome to remote forts along Hadrian's Wall in Britain. Emperors like Commodus were said to have been initiated. For a time, it looked as though Mithraism might become the dominant faith of the Roman world. But history took another course. As Christianity rose, it came into direct competition with Mithraism. The two religions shared striking similarities, both emphasized cult of the supreme being. In the late 18th century, as France trembled under the thunder of revolution, the old world of kings and priests was collapsing. Thrones were overturned, churches desecrated, and centuries of tradition swept away in a tidal wave of new ideas. Liberty, equality, and fraternity were proclaimed with fiery conviction, but beneath the ideals was chaos, bloodshed, and the desperate search for a new foundation. In this maelstrom, one of the strangest experiments in religious history emerged, the cult of the supreme being. It was neither Christianity nor atheism, but a radical attempt to create a civic religion for the modern age, born from revolution and shaped by terror. The story begins with the French Revolution, which erupted in 1789 with the storming of the Bastille and the overthrow of royal absolutism. The revolution was not just political but profoundly cultural. The monarchy and the Catholic Church had long been intertwined, with religion serving as a pillar of royal authority. To destroy the old order, revolutionaries sought not only to topple the king, but also to dismantle the Church's dominance. Priests were persecuted, church lands seized, and cathedrals stripped of their treasures. Some radicals even declared the cult of reason, an atheistic movement that celebrated human rationality and denounced traditional religion as superstition. But the cult of reason, for all its boldness, left many uneasy. To declare outright atheism was shocking in a society still steeped in centuries of Christian tradition. People could rebel against bishops and kings, but could they live without any God at all? Into this vacuum stepped Maximilien Robespierre, one of the revolution's most powerful and controversial leaders. Robespierre, often called the Incorruptible, was a man of rigid virtue and iron will. He despised the corruption of the old church, but the festival was meant to inspire awe and unity, to show that France had transcended both monarchy and atheism, and now worshipped a universal God of reason and morality. But to many, it felt contrived. The sight of Robespierre presiding like a prophet only fueled suspicion that he was seeking to make himself the dictator of France. Rivals mocked the festival as theatrical, calling it vanity, masquerading as piety. What was meant as a celebration of unity exposed the growing rift between Robespierre and other revolutionaries. The cult of the Supreme Being was short-lived. Just weeks after the Grand Festival, Robespierre fell from power during the Thermidorian reaction. Accused of tyranny and obsession, he was arrested and executed by guillotine in July 1894. With his death, the cult lost its driving force. The revolution staggered on, but the attempt to create a new civic religion collapsed. Within months, the cult of the Supreme Being faded into obscurity, remembered more as a curiosity than as a lasting faith. Yet despite its failure, the cult remains a fascinating experiment in the power of religion and politics. It showed the revolutionary desire not just to destroy the old, but to build something new, to fill the vacuum left by collapsing traditions. It revealed Robespierre's conviction that morality required belief in a higher power, even in a secular age, and it stands as one of the boldest examples of how political leaders have tried to harness religion to shape society. The cult of the Supreme Being also highlights the paradox of the French Revolution. On one hand, it proclaimed liberty, equality, and fraternity. On the other, it enforced conformity, demanding that citizens worship in the way prescribed by the state. A religion designed to promote freedom quickly became another instrument of control. It reminds us that even the noblest ideals can turn authoritarian when wielded without humility. Today, the cult of the Supreme Being may seem strange, a fleeting religion with no scripture, no priests, and no enduring community. Yet its questions remain deeply relevant. Can a society thrive without shared spiritual values? Can morality stand on its own without religion? Or do people need some vision of the transcendent to guide them beyond self-interest? Robespierre believed the answer was yes, but his attempt to impose that vision by decree showed the danger of forcing belief from above. The ruins of that experiment lie in history, but its lessons endure. The cult of the Supreme Being reminds us that revolutions, no matter how radical, cannot entirely escape the human hunger for the sacred. When old gods are dethroned, new ones often rise in their place, sometimes in temples, sometimes in ideologies, sometimes in the hearts of leaders who seek to embody virtue itself. In the end, Robespierre's dream of a civic religion died with him, but the echo of that moment, when a nation tried to replace centuries of faith with a new, man-made religion, still fascinates us. It shows both the power and the peril of trying to shape the soul of a people through politics. And it leaves us with a haunting image, a festival in Paris where the flames of revolution lit altars to a god who was meant to be both eternal and brand new, the Supreme Being of a world remade. Scientology, in the modern world, where technology and psychology intersect, one of the most controversial and talked about religions of the last century, was born, not in the ancient deserts or temples, but in the mid-20th century United States. Its founder was not a prophet in the traditional sense, but a science fiction writer, and its theology is a blend of spiritual healing, cosmic mythology, and self-empowerment. This is the story of Scientology, a religion that has been hailed as a path to personal freedom by some, and condemned as a manipulative cult by others. Whether viewed as faith, philosophy, or enterprise, Scientology is one of the most fascinating case studies in modern spirituality. The origins of Scientology trace back to L. Ron Hubbard, an American author known for his prolific output of science fiction and adventure stories. In 1950, Hubbard published a book called Dianetics, The Modern Science of Mental Health. In it, he proposed that the human mind is divided into two parts: the analytical mind, which is rational and logical, and the reactive mind, which stores painful memories and traumas. According to Hubbard, these traumas, called engrams, sabotage our well-being, causing fear, illness, and irrational behavior. By confronting and clearing these engrams, a person could achieve a state of clarity, free from the burdens of past suffering. This idea became the foundation of Dianetics therapy, a system Hubbard promoted enthusiastically. At first, it was framed as a form of mental health practice rather than religion. Patients, or pre-clears, would undergo auditing, a counseling process where a trained auditor asked questions designed to uncover hidden traumas. A device called the E-meter, measuring changes in electrical resistance on the skin, was used to detect subconscious reactions. Through repeated auditing, the pre-clear would move toward becoming a clear, a person free of engrams, capable of living with full rationality and emotional freedom. Dianetics spread quickly, attracting thousands of followers in the 1950s, but it also faced skepticism from psychologists and the medical establishment, who dismissed it as pseudoscience. Legal and financial troubles followed, leading Hubbard to reframe his movement not merely as therapy, but as a religion. In 1953, Scientology was formally established as a church, blending the self-help concepts of Dianetics with spiritual teachings and cosmic narratives. At its core, Scientology teaches that human beings are not just bodies or minds, but thetans, immortal spiritual beings with infinite potential. According to Hubbard, thetans have lived countless past lives, stretching back millions, even billions of years. They are essentially divine, but have become trapped in physical bodies, burdened by trauma, and blinded to their true nature. The goal of Scientology is to help thetans rediscover their power, achieve spiritual freedom, and ultimately transcend the material universe. This spiritual journey is charted in what Scientologists call the bridge to total freedom. The bridge is a series of steps, each representing greater levels of awareness and ability. The early stages focus on clearing the mind through auditing, while the higher stages, called operating thetan (OT) levels, reveal deeper spiritual truths. It is in these secret teachings that some of the most controversial aspects of Scientology appear. According to accounts from former members, the OT levels include the story of Xenu, a galactic ruler who, 75 million years ago, allegedly brought billions of beings to Earth, stacked them around volcanoes, and annihilated them with hydrogen bombs. Their disembodied souls, or body thetans, attach themselves to humans, causing spiritual damage that only advanced auditing can resolve. For critics, this bizarre mythology has been a source of ridicule, but for devoted Scientologists, it is sacred knowledge, part of their cosmic history and path to liberation. Scientology is not only a religion, but a tightly organized institution. The Church of Scientology operates a vast network of organizations, including celebrity centers that cater to actors, musicians, and other influential figures. Hubbard himself encouraged recruiting celebrities, believing their fame would spread the movement's influence. Over the years, prominent figures like Tom Cruise and John Travolta have become public advocates, fueling both admiration and criticism. The church also maintains a rigid hierarchy, with members dedicating themselves to service in what is known as the Sea Organization, or Sea Org, a religious order whose members sign billion-year contracts symbolizing their eternal commitment. Sea Org members live under strict discipline, often working long hours for little pay, believing they are contributing to the salvation of humanity. But alongside its growth has come controversy. Critics accuse Scientology of being authoritarian, exploitative, and litigious. Former members have described emotional manipulation, aggressive fundraising, and harsh punishment for dissent. Investigations and lawsuits in multiple countries have alleged abuse, harassment, and financial exploitation. The church, for its part, staunchly defends itself, insisting it is a misunderstood religion unfairly attacked by outsiders. It portrays itself as a champion of spiritual freedom, helping individuals unlock their full potential through structured training and auditing. Despite the controversy, Scientology has had remarkable resilience. From its beginnings in the 1950s, it grew into a global movement with centers in dozens of countries. Its flagship building in Clearwater, Florida, and its sprawling base in California are hubs of activity. Its teachings, though secretive, continue to attract followers seeking answers to life's deepest questions. What makes Scientology so fascinating is the way it blends modern psychology, ancient spirituality, and science fiction cosmology. It reflects the mid-20th century optimism about self-improvement, the Cold War-era fascination with science and technology, and the timeless human longing for transcendence. For some, it offers empowerment and community. For others, it represents the dangers of manipulation and control disguised as religion. At its heart, Scientology is about the promise of freedom, the idea that beneath all trauma and limitation, the true self is immortal, powerful, and divine. It speaks to the yearning in every human to rise above suffering and discover meaning in the vast universe. Whether viewed as visionary or deceptive, It is undeniably a product of its age, capturing the hopes and fears of a world grappling with modernity, science, and the search for new gods. The story of Scientology is still unfolding. It is not an ancient cult remembered only in books, but a living, evolving religion shaping lives today. Its controversies may overshadow its message, but its persistence proves that the human hunger for salvation, whether in temples, books, or galaxies, remains as strong as ever. Jonestown Movement. Few names in modern history provoke as much shock and sorrow as Jonestown. It was not a city, nor an ancient cult, but a settlement carved from the jungles of Guyana in the 1970s by followers of a charismatic preacher. For a time, it seemed like a utopia, a community built on ideals of equality, love, and justice, free from racism and oppression. But it ended in horror, a mass tragedy that claimed over 900 lives in one day. The story of the Jonestown Movement is a chilling lesson in how hope can turn to despair, how devotion can become control, and how one man's vision can lead thousands to destruction. The movement began with Jim Jones, an American preacher born in Indiana in 1931. From his earliest days, Jones showed a fascination with religion and power. He studied the Bible, imitated preachers, and was drawn to themes of justice and equality. In the 1950s, during the height of segregation, Jones founded the People's Temple, a church that combined Pentecostal-style preaching with progressive social activism. He preached racial integration at a time when it was deeply controversial, opening his doors to black and white worshipers alike. For many, this was revolutionary, an oasis of unity in a divided America. The People's Temple quickly grew, first in Indiana and later in California. Jones's sermons blended Christianity with socialist ideals, calling for a community where wealth was shared, racism abolished, and the poor uplifted. His followers believed he was not just a pastor, but a prophet, perhaps even a messiah. He often staged faith healings, some genuine acts of comfort, others reportedly fake to impress the crowd. Yet for many, his charisma was undeniable. He promised not only spiritual salvation, but real-world justice, and people flocked to him. But as the church expanded, so did Jones's control. He demanded loyalty, encouraged members to cut ties with family, and punished dissent harshly. The People's Temple was not just a church, but a tightly controlled community where Jones's word was law. Members surrendered income and property, living communally under his direction. To outsiders, this looked suspiciously like a cult. To insiders, it was the price of building God's kingdom on earth. By the mid-1970s, Jones's paranoia grew. He feared government persecution, media scrutiny, and betrayal from within. To escape what he saw as a corrupt and oppressive American system, he led his followers to establish a new settlement in Guyana, a small country on the northern coast of South America. There, deep in the jungle, they built Jonestown, named after their leader. It was meant to be a socialist paradise, free of racism, greed, and exploitation, a model for humanity. At first, Jonestown seemed promising. Members worked the fields, built houses, and sang songs of unity. Visitors described it as a community of hope, where children played freely and people labored together for the common good. But beneath the surface, cracks appeared. The settlement was isolated, the jungle harsh, and supplies scarce. Daily life was grueling, with long hours of labor and little food. Jones's paranoia intensified. He controlled information, broadcast speeches over loudspeakers day and night, and staged loyalty tests where followers were asked to prove their devotion. Inside Jonestown, Jones's word was absolute. He portrayed himself as a father figure, even as God incarnate. He demanded obedience, used fear to maintain control, and punished dissent with public humiliation or confinement. Followers were told that enemies, capitalists, racists, and the CIA were plotting to destroy them. In this atmosphere of fear and isolation, questioning Jones became unthinkable. The turning point came in 1978, when relatives of temple members and journalists raised alarms about conditions in Jonestown. Reports of abuse, forced labor, and imprisonment reached the U.S. government. In November of that year, Congressman Leo Ryan led a delegation to investigate. At first, Jones welcomed the visitors, staging performances to show Jonestown in a positive light, but cracks quickly showed. Several members begged Ryan to take them home, Tension grew, and as the congressman's group prepared to leave, Jones ordered an attack. Gunmen ambushed Ryan and his party at a nearby airstrip, killing the congressman, 3 journalists, and a temple defector. This act sealed Jonestown's fate. Jones told his followers that the outside world would now come for them, that there was no escape. He declared that the only option was revolutionary suicide, a mass death that would protest oppression and preserve their dignity. Under his direction, vats of flavored drink laced with cyanide were prepared. Mothers gave poison to their children, families drank together, and guards ensured compliance. Over 900 people died that day, including more than 300 children. Jones himself was found dead with a gunshot wound to the head. Whether by suicide or another's hand remains debated. The world awoke to headlines of horror. Jonestown had become the largest mass death of American civilians in history at that time, second only to 9/11 decades later. Images of bodies sprawled in the jungle shocked the globe. The word Jonestown became synonymous with blind obedience, cult tragedy, and the dangers of charismatic leadership. But the story of Jonestown is more than just its terrible end. For many who joined the People's Temple, the journey began with genuine hope for racial equality, social justice, and community in a lonely world. They were not fools or fanatics, but ordinary people seeking meaning and belonging. That longing was twisted by Jones's hunger for control, turned into manipulation, fear, and ultimately death. Jonestown's tragedy is a reminder of how vulnerable human beings can be when their deepest hopes are bound to the will of a single leader. The legacy of Jonestown endures in countless warnings. Scholars, journalists, and survivors have studied it as a case of cult dynamics, group psychology, and authoritarian control. It illustrates how isolation, fear, and devotion can override personal judgment, how a community can slide from idealism into nightmare without its members realizing until it's too late. It is also a testament to the human desire for belonging, a desire so strong it can lead people to surrender everything, even their lives. Today, the phrase "drinking the Kool-Aid" has entered popular language, used to describe blind faith or unquestioning obedience. But behind that casual phrase lies real suffering, the memory of children who never chose, of families who believed in a dream that became a nightmare. Jonestown is not just a cautionary tale, it is a human tragedy that demands empathy as well as analysis. The Jonestown Movement reveals both the nobility and danger of human ideals. It shows how visions of justice can inspire thousands, but also how unchecked power can corrupt absolutely. It reminds us that communities built on devotion must also allow freedom, dissent, and accountability. Without these, even the brightest dream can descend into darkness. In the end, Jonestown is a story not only about one man's madness, but about the fragile line between faith and control, hope and despair. It is a story that continues to haunt the modern world, asking each of us, what happens when we place our deepest trust in the wrong hands? Ghost shirt religion. In the late 19th century, on the wide plains of North America, Native peoples faced one of the darkest chapters in their history. Their lands had been seized, their buffalo herds slaughtered, their traditions suppressed, and their communities forced onto barren reservations. Disease, hunger, and despair spread like wildfire. Yet even in this devastation, a spark of hope emerged, a vision of renewal that promised to restore the world, to bring back the ancestors, to drive out the oppressors, and to heal the wounds of conquest. This movement came to be known as the ghost dance religion, and at its heart was the belief in the protective power of the ghost shirt. The origins of this movement trace back to the visions of Wovoka, a Paiute prophet born in Nevada in 1856. Wovoka grew up during a time of great upheaval as settlers encroached on Paiute lands, and the U.S. government imposed its authority with increasing force. Amid poverty and struggle, Wovoka became known for his spiritual gifts. He was a healer, a visionary, and a man deeply attuned to the sacred. In the winter of 1889 to 1890, during a solar eclipse, Wovoka experienced a vision that would transform Native spirituality across the West. He claimed to have journeyed to the spirit world, where he encountered God and the souls of the departed. There, he was told that if Native peoples lived righteously, abandoned violence, and performed a sacred dance, a great transformation would come. The earth would be renewed, the dead would return, the buffalo would once again cover the plains, and the white oppressors would vanish. In this vision, the world would be restored to harmony, and native peoples would live free as they once had. The central ritual of this prophecy was the ghost dance. It was a circle dance, performed in rhythmic, communal movement that could last for hours or even days. Participants wore specially made shirts, ghost shirts, that were believed to have spiritual power, capable of protecting the wearer from bullets. To many, these garments symbolize not only physical safety, but also spiritual armor, a visible sign of hope in the face of overwhelming violence. The ghost dance spread like wildfire, moving from tribe to tribe. The Lakota, Arapaho, Cheyenne, and many others embraced it with fervent faith. For native communities crushed under the weight of loss, the ghost dance was more than ritual. It was a revolution of the spirit. It restored dignity, gave meaning to suffering, and offered a vision of a world where the injustices of conquest would be undone. It united tribes across vast distances, transcending old rivalries, as people shared in the common dream of renewal. Songs, prayers, and dances echoed across the plains, proclaiming that a new dawn was coming. But to the U.S. government and military, the ghost dance was seen not as spiritual revival, but as rebellion. Reports of large gatherings and the spread of the ghost shirt belief alarmed officials who feared an uprising. To them, the sight of hundreds of native people dancing with fervor, proclaiming that bullets could not harm them, looked like preparation for war. Authorities moved to suppress the movement, banning the dance and sending troops to reservations. Tensions reached their breaking point with the Lakota Sioux, who embraced the ghost dance with particular intensity. In December 1890, the U.S. Army attempted to disarm a group of Lakota near Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota. Fear, confusion, and mistrust led to violence. Soldiers opened fire, killing men, women, and children in what became known as the Wounded Knee Massacre. Over 250 Lakota were slaughtered, their ghost shirts soaked in blood, their faith in protection shattered in the most brutal way. The massacre at Wounded Knee effectively ended the ghost dance movement as a mass phenomenon. For the U.S. government, it was a final act of suppression, crushing what they perceived as dangerous fanaticism. For native peoples, it was another devastating tragedy, confirming the relentless violence of colonization. Yet the ghost dance did not vanish entirely. It survived in memory, in ritual, and in the songs that continued to be sung quietly in hidden gatherings. The ghost shirt religion remains a symbol of resistance and resilience. At one level, it was a desperate response to oppression, an attempt to reclaim power through spiritual means when all material options had been stripped away. At another level, it was a profound statement of faith, that despite conquest, despite massacres, despite despair, the world could be renewed and justice restored. Historians and anthropologists have debated the ghost dance for decades. Some see it as a millenarian movement, a native version of apocalyptic prophecy. Others see it as an act of cultural survival, a way for communities to reassert identity and unity. Still others argue that it was misunderstood by authorities, who mistook a peaceful ritual for armed rebellion. In truth, it was all of these things, a complex, deeply human attempt to find hope in the midst of catastrophe. The ghost shirts themselves have become iconic. Made of cloth, decorated with symbols of eagles, stars, or sacred designs, they embodied the belief that faith could protect against the most advanced weapons of the time. While bullets ultimately pierced them at Wounded Knee, their symbolic power has never been extinguished. They remain emblems of courage, belief, and the enduring struggle of native peoples to protect their lives and traditions. Today, the ghost dance and ghost shirt religion are remembered not only as tragic history, but as living heritage. Native communities continue to honor the memory of Wovoka's vision and the resilience of their ancestors. The ghost dance is still performed in some traditions, not as prophecy of the white man's disappearance, but as a prayer for healing, balance, and survival. It stands as a reminder that even in the darkest times, hope cannot be erased. The story of the ghost shirt religion is one of both hope and heartbreak. It shows how spiritual visions can inspire unity and courage, but also how fear and misunderstanding can turn hope into tragedy. It reminds us of the devastating cost of conquest, the resilience of the human spirit, and the enduring power of faith to imagine a better world. Wovoka's prophecy may not have come to pass as his followers believed, but in another sense, it lives on. Every time native voices sing, every time traditions are preserved, every time communities assert their identity and rights, the vision of renewal continues. The ghost shirt religion was not simply about bullets or shirts. It was about the unbroken spirit of a people who, in the face of overwhelming loss, dared to dance for a new world. Cult of the Emperor. In the grand arenas, marble temples, and bustling forums of the Roman Empire, religion was not just about gods in the heavens. It was also about the man who ruled on earth. To the Romans, loyalty to the emperor was inseparable from loyalty to the empire itself. This loyalty became ritualized in one of history's most powerful and politically charged religious systems, the cult of the emperor. It was not a faith of personal salvation like Christianity, nor a philosophy like Stoicism. It was a civic religion, designed to bind a vast and diverse empire together under the sacred authority of its ruler. The roots of emperor worship stretch back to ancient traditions. Long before Rome, rulers in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Greece had been treated as divine or semi-divine. Pharaohs were considered gods in human form. Alexander the Great demanded divine honors after his conquests. Rome inherited and adapted these ideas, blending them into its own political culture. Yet in Rome, the system was more complex. The emperor was not always declared a god during his lifetime. Often he was deified after death, becoming a divus, a divine figure to be honored with temples and sacrifices. The story of the cult truly begins with Julius Caesar. After his assassination in 4 BCE, the Roman Senate officially declared him a god, Divus Julius. A temple was built in his honor, and his adopted heir, Octavian, later Augustus, skillfully used this deification to legitimize his own power. As the son of the divine Julius, Augustus could claim both political and sacred authority. Though Augustus himself preferred to be worshipped as the first citizen rather than a living god, cults in the provinces quickly began offering him divine honors. From this point on, emperor worship became an integral part of Rome's identity. The cult of the emperor was more than mere flattery. It was a unifying force for an empire that stretched from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to Syria. Local communities across this vast territory had their own gods, languages, and traditions, but all could gather in temples dedicated to the emperor, perform sacrifices in his honor, and affirm their loyalty to Rome. It was a common ritual that bound diverse peoples into one imperial family. Temples to emperors were erected across the empire, often at the expense of local rulers eager to show devotion. In cities like Ephesus, Pergamon, and Smyrna, magnificent shrines stood as symbols of both faith and politics. Festivals celebrated the emperor's birthday or victories, with processions, sacrifices, and games. The emperor's image appeared on coins, statues, and altars, reinforcing the idea that he was not merely a political leader, but a sacred presence in daily life. Yet emperor worship had a dual nature. On one hand, it was voluntary reverence, a way for subjects to honor the man who embodied Rome's greatness. On the other, it was political obligation. To refuse participation in the cult was to risk being seen as disloyal to the empire itself. This tension became especially sharp with the rise of Christianity. Christians refused to offer sacrifices to the emperor, insisting that worship belonged to God alone. For this, they were accused not of impiety but of treason. By rejecting the cult, they appeared to reject Rome. This refusal led to waves of persecution, as emperors like Nero and Diocletian saw the Christian refusal to participate as a direct threat to imperial unity. Ironically, the cult of the emperor helped define Christianity's identity, sharpening the boundary between church and state, faith and politics. The theology of emperor worship evolved over time. Some emperors were modest, accepting honors but avoiding outright claims of divinity. Others embraced the cult with zeal. Caligula demanded worship as a living god, ordering his statue to be placed in the Temple of Jerusalem, a move that nearly sparked rebellion. Domitian referred to himself as Lord and God. These extremes fueled resentment, but they also reveal how potent the cult could be when fused with personal ambition. The cult was not merely about divine titles. It was about ritual and symbol. Sacrifices of animals, offerings of incense, and prayers were made before statues of the emperor. Festivals blended entertainment with devotion, reinforcing loyalty through spectacle. The imagery of the emperor as a cosmic figure, standing among the gods, radiating divine light, permeated Roman art. The emperor was portrayed not just as ruler, but as guarantor of order, peace, and prosperity, the human embodiment of Rome's greatness. At its peak, the cult of the emperor was inseparable from Roman identity. To be Roman was to honor the gods and the emperor alike. This did not mean ordinary people worshipped the emperor as they did Jupiter or Mars. Rather, it meant acknowledging his unique role as the divine protector of the empire. In a world where politics and religion were entwined, this blending felt natural. The emperor was not above the gods, but he was their chosen representative on earth. Over time, however, the cult's power waned. As Christianity spread and gained imperial favor, the exclusive worship of one god undermined the emperor's divine status. When Constantine embraced Christianity in the 4th century, the cult began to dissolve. Later emperors still claimed sacred authority, but now, as Christian rulers, gods chosen on earth rather than gods themselves. The old temples fell silent, their altars abandoned, as a new faith redefined the relationship between ruler and divine. Yet the legacy of the cult of the emperor lives on. It revealed how religion could serve political power, how ritual could forge unity across vast diversity, and how symbols could sustain authority. In many ways, it foreshadowed later ideas of divine kingship, absolute monarchy, and even the modern cult of personality. When leaders today are portrayed as saviors, icons, or larger-than-life figures, echoes of Rome's emperor worship can still be heard. The cult of the emperor was never just about belief. It was about belonging. It reminded Romans that their loyalty was not only to a city or army, but to a sacred order embodied in their ruler. It bound them in a shared ritual of devotion, one that turned politics into religion and a man into something more than mortal. For centuries, the empire thrived on this fusion of power and piety, and though the emperors are gone, their cult still stands as one of history's most striking examples of how faith can be shaped, molded, and used to sustain the greatest of human ambitions, the rule of an empire. Shintoism's kami worship. In the islands of Japan, where mountains rise like sacred guardians and rivers carve paths through ancient forests, spirituality has always been deeply tied to nature. Long before Buddhism, Confucianism, or Christianity arrived, the Japanese people developed a unique way of understanding the divine. It was not a faith of distant gods and far-off heavens, nor of strict doctrines written in holy books. Instead, it was a way of seeing the sacred woven into the world itself. This is Shinto, often called the Way of the Gods, and at the heart of it is the worship of kami, the spirits, forces, and presences that inhabit the universe. To understand Shinto, one must first understand kami. The word is often translated as gods, but this is misleading. Kami are not gods in the Western sense, with human forms and rigid personalities. They are more subtle, more fluid. Kami can be found in towering mountains, in ancient trees, in the shimmering sun, or in the quiet flow of a stream. They can also be the spirits of ancestors, great leaders, or cultural heroes. Even qualities like fertility, harmony, or courage can be understood as kami. In essence, kami are the sacred energies that animate the world, bridging the human and the divine. Shinto does not imagine a sharp line between the sacred and the ordinary. To the Japanese worldview shaped by Shinto, the divine is not elsewhere. It is here, all around, in the soil, the sky, the seasons. This way of seeing gives life a profound sense of reverence. A farmer bows before planting seeds, acknowledging the kami of the earth. A fisherman offers prayers before casting nets, honoring the kami of the sea. Every act of life is, in a sense, a dialogue with the unseen world. The worship of kami takes place in shrines known as jinja. These shrines, scattered across Japan, can be grand complexes with soaring gates or humbasur, the wooden structures nestled in forests. Each shrine is dedicated to one or more kami, serving as a meeting place between humans and the divine. The entrance is often marked by a torii gate, a simple yet powerful symbol that signifies the threshold between the ordinary world and the sacred space. Passing beneath it, worshippers step into the realm of the kami. Rituals at shrines are simple but deeply meaningful. Worshippers purify themselves by washing hands and rinsing mouths at a basin, then approach the main hall. There, they bow, clap their hands to attract the kami's attention, and offer prayers. Sometimes they leave coins, food, or sake as offerings. Festivals, known as matsuri, bring communities together to honor local kami with music, dancing, and processions. These celebrations blend joy and reverence, reminding people that worship is not only solemn but also life-affirming. Unlike many religions, Shinto has no single founder, no sacred scripture, and no rigid system of beliefs. It is a tradition that grew organically from the land and its people. Its stories, known as myths, were recorded in texts like the Kojiki, records of ancient matters, and the Nihon Shoki, chronicles of Japan, compiled in the 8th century. These myths tell of the creation of Japan by the kami Izanagi and Izanami, and of their descendants, including Amaterasu, the sun goddess, who is revered as the ancestor of Japan's imperial line. These myths give Shinto its cosmic framework, but they are not dogma. They are living stories, shaping identity and culture. The worship of kami is also deeply tied to the imperial institution. For centuries, Japanese emperors were regarded as direct descendants of Amaterasu, embodying divine authority. Imperial rituals to honor the sun goddess and other kami were seen as essential to the well-being of the nation. This connection between Shinto and state power became especially pronounced in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when state Shinto was established as a national ideology. During this time, Shinto was used to foster loyalty, nationalism, and unity, with the emperor portrayed as a living god. After World War II, however, state Shinto was dismantled, and the emperor renounced claims to divinity, returning Shinto to its role as a cultural and spiritual tradition rather than a political tool. One of the most distinctive aspects of Shinto is its emphasis on purity. To draw near the kami, one must be free of pollution, both physical and spiritual. Ritual purification, known as harai, takes many forms: washing hands, standing under waterfalls, or waving sacred objects to cleanse negative energies. This focus on purity reflects the Shinto worldview. The world is not inherently sinful, but it can become clouded by disorder, impurity, or neglect. By restoring purity, harmony with the kami is renewed. Shinto's kami worship also coexists seamlessly with other traditions. For centuries, Shinto has intertwined with Buddhism, which entered Japan in the 6th century. Many shrines and temples exist side by side, and people often practice both without contradiction. A family may visit a Shinto shrine for New Year's blessings, a Buddhist temple for ancestral rites, and even incorporate elements of Confucian ethics in daily life. This flexibility reflects Shinto's essence. It is less about exclusive belief than about harmonious living. The aesthetic of Shinto is woven into Japanese culture. The architecture of shrines, with their simplicity and elegance, mirrors the natural world. The Torii Gate rising against the backdrop of mountains or seas is one of Japan's most iconic images. Seasonal festivals, agricultural rituals, and artistic expressions all carry echoes of kami worship. Even modern practices, like the reverence for cherry blossoms, trace their roots to Shinto's view of life as fleeting yet sacred. In the modern age, Shinto remains vibrant. Millions of Japanese visit shrines regularly, especially during festivals or life milestones, births, weddings, New Year's celebrations. Shinto priests, clad in white robes, continue ancient rituals, while Miko, shrine maidens, assist with dances and ceremonies. International visitors, too, are drawn to Shinto shrines, finding in them a sense of peace and beauty. The quiet rustle of leaves in a shrine grove, the sound of water trickling at a purification basin, the sight of a simple offering, all convey a spirituality rooted not in distant heavens, but in the living world. Kami worship also speaks powerfully to contemporary concerns. In an era of environmental crisis, Shinto's reverence for nature offers wisdom. To see rivers, mountains, and forests as sacred is to treat them with respect and care. In this way, Shinto is not only an ancient tradition, but also a modern reminder of humanity's bond with the earth. Ultimately, Shinto's kami worship is not about doctrines or commandments, but about relationship between humans, nature, ancestors, and the unseen world. It is about living in harmony, respecting the sacred around us, and finding beauty in simplicity. It reminds us that the divine does not need to be distant or abstract. It can be as close as the wind, the sunlight, or the spirit of a loved one. The story of Shinto and its kami is the story of a people who found the sacred in the rhythms of their land, who honored the forces that sustain them, and who continue to keep those bonds alive. It is a story of reverence, resilience, and renewal, a reminder that the divine is not only above, but also within and around us, in every stone, every tree, every breath of the living world. Aghori Sect. Along the banks of the sacred Ganges River, particularly near the burning ghats of Varanasi, one may glimpse a figure that unsettles the unprepared eye. A man covered in ash from cremated bodies, draped in rags or nothing at all, chanting mantras, and perhaps even drinking from a human skull. This is not a scene of madness, but of devotion. Such figures belong to the Aghori Sect, one of the most mysterious and extreme paths in Hindu spirituality. To outsiders, the Aghoris inspire fear and fascination, associated with death, taboo, and the grotesque. But to themselves, their practices are not about horror, but about liberation, the breaking of illusions, and the discovery of ultimate truth. The Aghoris are a small but significant ascetic order within Hinduism, emerging from the Apocalyptic tradition, itself linked to Shaivism, the worship of Lord Shiva. To understand them, one must understand Shiva's paradoxical nature. Shiva is not just the god of creation, but also of destruction. He is the ascetic yogi meditating on Mount Kailash, yet also the wild lord of cremation grounds, surrounded by spirits. He represents both purity and impurity, life and death, creation and dissolution. For the Aghoris, to follow Shiva is to embrace his totality, to reject nothing, and to see divinity even in what the world calls impure. Central to Aghori philosophy is the belief in Advaita, or non-duality. In their eyes, all distinctions, pure and impure, holy and unholy, life and death, are illusions created by the mind. If God is truly everywhere, then God must also be present in filth, in corpses, in what society rejects. To realize this is to transcend fear, disgust, and attachment. Thus, the shocking practices of the Aghoris are not acts of rebellion for their own sake, but spiritual disciplines meant to shatter duality and bring the seeker to enlightenment. One of their most striking practices is their dwelling in cremation grounds. While most Hindus avoid such places, considering them polluted, Aghoris make them their home. To them, the burning ghat is not a place of impurity, but a sacred threshold, where the cycle of life and death is laid bare. Watching bodies burn, they meditate on impermanence, facing mortality directly rather than fleeing from it. Ash from the cremated remains is smeared on their skin, symbolizing both renunciation of the ego and union with Shiva, the lord of cremation grounds. The Aghoris are also known for using human skulls as bowls and ritual objects. Drinking and eating from them is not an act of savagery, but of devotion, symbolizing detachment from worldly taboos and recognition that the body is but a vessel, temporary and perishable. Some accounts describe Aghoris consuming flesh from corpses or using bones in ritual. While such practices are extremely rare and often exaggerated by outsiders, they reflect the Aghori principle that nothing in creation is outside the divine. Their rituals often involve acts considered polluting by Orthodox Hindu standards. They may meditate while seated on corpses, eat food regarded as unclean, or engage in acts designed to break all attachments to conventional morality. These practices are not about indulgence, but about mastery. By confronting the deepest fears and disgusts of human existence, the Aghori seeks to transcend them, achieving a state of spiritual freedom beyond good and evil. Yet Aghoris are not merely figures of fear. Many are also healers, known for their deep knowledge of Ayurveda, herbal medicine, and mantras. People often come to them seeking blessings, cures, or guidance. Their reputation as both terrifying ascetics and compassionate mystics reflects the duality they embody. Some live as wandering mendicants, others as reclusive hermits, and a few maintain small shrams where teachings are passed down. To the ordinary world, the Aghoris appear shocking, even dangerous. But within their own tradition, they are seen as seekers of the highest truth, walking a razor's edge. Their rejection of social norms is not nihilism, but a spiritual method. By embracing what society rejects, they seek to realize that the divine is not limited to temples, rituals, or purity. It is present in every aspect of existence. The philosophy behind their path can be summed up in a radical question. If God is infinite, then what can be outside of God? For the Aghori, the answer is nothing. Therefore, even in what seems impure, even in death and decay, the divine is fully present. To embrace this truth is to shatter illusion and attain liberation. Historically, the Aghori Sect has been small, with numbers in the hundreds rather than thousands. They trace their lineage to Baba Kinaram, a 17th century ascetic revered as the father of the order. His shrine in Varanasi remains a center of Aghori practice and pilgrimage. Over time, their reputation spread, fueled by both reverence and fear. Colonial accounts often painted them as grotesque fanatics, while popular imagination turned them into almost mythical figures. In the modern world, the Aghoris continue to fascinate. Documentaries and travelers' tales often sensationalize their practices, focusing on corpse rituals or skull cups. Yet behind the sensational lies a profound philosophy, the rejection of illusion, the acceptance of all existence as divine, and the pursuit of absolute freedom. For many spiritual seekers, the Aghoris embody the extremity of the quest for truth, walking paths most would never dare tread. Their path also raises deeper questions for all of us. Why do we fear death so deeply? Why do we label parts of existence as impure or unworthy? What would it mean to see the sacred in everything, even in what we reject? The Aghoris Cha Souls lenge us not to imitate their practices, but to question our assumptions about purity, divinity, and the boundaries we draw between sacred and profane. Today, the Aghori Sect survives on the margins of society, often misunderstood but still carrying its ancient lineage. They remain reminders of spirituality's radical edge, that religion is not always about comfort or convention, but sometimes about confrontation with the darkest aspects of life. Their ash-covered bodies, their meditations among flames, their chants rising with the smoke of burning bodies, all speak of a vision that refuses to turn away from the ultimate truth, that death and life are not opposites, but parts of a single divine whole. The Aghori Sect is both terrifying and profound, both rejected and revered. In their shocking practices lies a deep message that God is everywhere, and until we see the sacred even in what we fear most, we have not truly understood divinity. Order of the Solar Temple. In the late 20th century, when the world seemed increasingly modern, rational, and scientific, one might think that the age of secret mystical cults had passed. Yet even in this era of computers and space exploration, groups emerged that wove together ancient mysticism, conspiracy theories, and apocalyptic visions. Among them, few were as notorious or tragic as the Order of the Solar Temple. Its name evoked mystery and grandeur, drawing from medieval knights and esoteric traditions. But its story ended not in enlightenment, but in a series of shocking mass deaths that stunned the world in the 90s. The Order of the Solar Temple was founded in 1984 by Joseph de Mombro, a French-Canadian mystic, and Luc Jouret, a Belgian homeopathic doctor and charismatic speaker. Both men were steeped in esoteric traditions, fascinated by the occult, and influenced by groups such as the Knights Templar, the Rosicrucians, and New Age spirituality. They envisioned the order as a secret society that would guide humanity through a coming apocalypse, preserve sacred knowledge, and prepare chosen initiates for a spiritual rebirth in a higher dimension. At its core, the order taught that the world was heading toward catastrophic collapse. To survive this upheaval, members needed to purify themselves spiritually and align with cosmic forces. The order presented itself as the heir to the medieval Knights Templar, claiming a lineage of secret wisdom passed down through the centuries. Members were told that by joining, they were becoming part of a sacred brotherhood, charged with preserving truth and guiding humanity. Ritual played a central role in the order's identity. Members participated in elaborate ceremonies that blended Christian symbolism, astrology, Egyptian mysticism, and Templar imagery. Dressed in robes, carrying swords, and standing before altars lit with candles, initiates swore oaths of secrecy and devotion. These rituals gave the group an air of grandeur, connecting members to what seemed like an ancient and powerful tradition. But beneath the mystique was manipulation. Joseph de Mombro, the order's true leader, claimed to have access to higher spiritual beings known as the Masters of the Universe. He staged dramatic miracles during rituals, such as glowing lights, apparitions, and voices from beyond, to convince followers of his divine authority. Later investigations revealed that these were illusions created with hidden projectors, stagecraft, and technology. For members, however, the experiences felt real, deepening their faith in Di Mambro's leadership. The order attracted professionals, doctors, businessmen, and the wealthy, people searching for meaning beyond material success. Luc Jouret, with his charisma and eloquence, preached about ecological disaster, spiritual awakening, and the coming end of the world. He presented the order as both an elite spiritual community and a refuge from a corrupt society. For many, it was intoxicating, a blend of belonging, mystery, and destiny. Yet as the years passed, the teachings grew darker. Di Mambro became increasingly obsessed with loyalty and purity. He taught that some members' children were not ordinary but cosmic children, chosen souls destined for higher purposes. He declared his own daughter, Emmanuelle, to be one such child. At the same time, he grew paranoid, convinced that enemies were plotting against him and the order. Members who questioned him were silenced or expelled, and dissent was painted as betrayal of the sacred mission. The climax came in the early 90s, when Di Mambro and Jouret began preparing their followers for what they called the transit, a passage from this corrupt world to a higher plane of existence near the star Sirius. They told members that the end of the world was imminent, and that by dying together in ritual, they would ascend to a new life beyond the earth. Between 94 and 97, the Order of the Solar Temple carried out a series of shocking mass deaths in Switzerland, Canada, and France. In October 94, dozens of members were found dead in Switzerland and Quebec, some by suicide, others murdered, all dressed in ceremonial robes. Many had been drugged or shot before their bodies were arranged in ritualistic patterns. Fires consumed several of the sites, leaving behind charred remains and cryptic messages about renewal and cosmic rebirth. 2 years later, in 95, another group of followers died in France under similar circumstances. Again, some deaths appeared voluntary, others forced. In 97, 15 more members were found in Quebec, in yet another orchestrated transit. In total, over 70 people lost their lives across these events, shocking the world and raising haunting questions. Were these suicides, murders, or both? How had educated, rational people been led into such tragedy? For investigators, the Order of the Solar Temple was a chilling reminder of the power of charismatic leadership, secrecy, and apocalyptic belief. Di Mambro had manipulated his followers with staged miracles, promises of cosmic destiny, and threats of doom. Those who trusted him surrendered their wealth, their autonomy, and ultimately their lives. For society at large, the deaths were a wake-up call. In the 90s, several cult tragedies captured global attention, including the Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas, and the Heaven's Gate mass suicide in California. The Order of the Solar Temple stood among them as a stark example of how, even in a modern, secular age, people could be drawn into dangerous movements, promising salvation in the face of crisis. Yet to reduce the Order's story to madness or fanaticism is to miss its deeper lessons. Many who joined were searching for meaning, community, and hope in a rapidly changing world. They longed for our connection to something greater than themselves, for certainty in an age of uncertainty. The Order offered answers, rituals, and a sense of destiny. That longing was exploited by leaders who cloaked manipulation in the language of spirituality. Today, the Order of the Solar Temple is remembered less for its teachings than for its tragic end. Its rituals, symbols, and esoteric claims are studied as part of the history of new religious movements, but its name evokes images of fire, secrecy, and death. The cult's downfall reveals the dangers of unchecked authority, blind faith, and apocalyptic thinking. The story also forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The human hunger for meaning is so powerful that it can lead people to surrender everything, even their lives, when guided by the wrong hands. The Order of the Solar Temple reminds us that spirituality, while a source of hope and transformation, can also become a weapon of control when wielded by those who claim absolute authority. In the end, the Order of the Solar Temple did not lead its members to a higher plane of existence. It led them to fire and ash, to mass graves and headlines of horror. But the questions it raises remain. Why do people seek leaders who promise cosmic salvation? Why are we drawn to secret wisdom, to apocalyptic visions, to promises of rebirth beyond this world. And how can we protect that longing for transcendence from being twisted into tragedy? The Order of the Solar Temple stands as one of history's most chilling reminders that the search for light can sometimes lead into darkness, and that the promise of the stars can end in flames. Zoroastrian Dualism, long before Christianity, Islam, or Buddhism spread across the globe, there was a faith born in the deserts and mountains of ancient Persia that shaped much of humanity's later spiritual imagination. It gave the world a dramatic vision of the universe as a battlefield between good and evil, light and darkness, truth and falsehood. This faith is Zoroastrianism, one of the oldest known organized religions, and at its heart lies the profound idea of dualism. For centuries, this vision guided empires, influenced prophets, and laid the groundwork for many ideas that would later appear in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The story begins with the prophet Zarathustra, or Zoroaster, who lived perhaps around 1200 to 1000 BCE, though scholars debate the exact date. Born in ancient Iran, Zoroaster grew up in a culture steeped in polytheistic traditions, where many gods were worshipped through rituals involving fire, sacrifice, and intoxicating drinks. But he experienced visions that convinced him the universe was not governed by many chaotic deities, but by one supreme god of truth and light, Ahura Mazda. This revelation became the cornerstone of Zoroastrian belief. Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, is the source of all that is good, light, truth, justice, and life itself. But Zoroaster also saw that the world was filled with suffering, lies, and destruction. To explain this, he taught that a powerful opposing force existed, Angra Mainyu, later known as Ahriman, the spirit of deceit, evil, and chaos. Thus, Zoroastrianism framed existence as a cosmic struggle between two primal forces, Spenta Mainyu, the Holy Spirit, aligned with Ahura Mazda, and Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit. This vision of cosmic dualism was revolutionary. It portrayed the universe not as random or morally neutral, but as a battlefield where every human choice mattered. People were not Powie, less pawns. They were soldiers in the struggle. By choosing truth, compassion, and justice, they sided with Ahura Mazda. By choosing lies, cruelty, and destruction, they strengthened Angra Mainyu. Unlike religions that emphasized fate, Zoroastrianism emphasized free will. Humanity had a sacred responsibility to help tip the balance toward good. The daily life of Zoroastrians was deeply shaped by this dualism. Purity was central. Fire, seen as the purest element and a symbol of divine truth, was kept burning in temples and homes. Even today, Zoroastrian worship takes place in fire temples, where eternal flames are tended as signs of Ahura Mazda's presence. Rituals emphasized cleanliness, truth-telling, and respect for the natural world. Pollution, whether physical or moral, was seen as the work of Angra Mainyu, something to be resisted through discipline and devotion. Ethics in Zoroastrianism were summed up in a simple but profound triad: good thoughts, good words, good deeds. This was not mere moral advice, but a cosmic duty. Every good thought aligned the mind with truth. Every good word reinforced harmony in the world. Every good deed pushed back against the power of evil. In this way, ordinary life, farming, raising families, telling the truth, became sacred acts in the eternal war between light and darkness. Zoroastrian dualism also carried a vision of ultimate destiny. Zoroaster taught that though evil was powerful, it was not eternal. In the end, Ahura Mazda's light would triumph, and creation would be purified. At the final judgment, the dead would be resurrected, and all souls would walk across the Chinvat Bridge, which separated the righteous from the wicked. For the good, the bridge was wide and safe, leading to paradise. For the evil, it became razor-thin, casting them into a place of torment. But even hell was not eternal. Eventually, all souls would be purified in a river of molten metal, cleansed of evil, and reunited with Ahura Mazda in a renewed, perfect world. This vision of a final battle, resurrection, judgment, heaven, and hell profoundly influenced later religions. Judaism during the exiles in Babylon absorbed many Zoroastrian ideas, which later appeared in Christianity and Islam. The very notion of Satan as a cosmic adversary, the dualism of heaven and hell, and the promise of an end-time renewal all carry echoes of Zoroastrian thought. In this sense, Zoroastrianism was a seedbed for much of Western religious imagination. But Zoroastrian dualism was not only theological, it was political. In the great Persian empires, especially under the Achaemenid kings like Cyrus the Great and Darius, Zoroastrianism became a guiding ideology. Kings were portrayed as chosen by Ahura Mazda, tasked with upholding truth, Asha, against falsehood, Druj. Inscriptions celebrated their role as protectors of justice, order, and purity. This sacred kingship gave empires moral authority and unified diverse peoples under a shared cosmic vision. Over time, however, Zoroastrianism faced challenges. The rise of Islam in the 7th century brought the decline of Zoroastrian dominance in Persia. Many followers converted, and the faith became a minority, surviving primarily in small communities in Iran and India, where Zoroastrians are known as Parsis. Yet, even in decline, the dualistic worldview endured, carried forward in rituals, prayers, and cultural identity. Modern Zoroastrians still recite prayers to Ahura Mazda, light sacred fires, and strive to live by good thoughts, words, and deeds. Though their numbers are small, perhaps only a few 100,000 worldwide, their legacy is vast. The dualism they preserved continues to shape how billions of people imagine good and evil, life and death, salvation and damnation. What makes Zoroastrian dualism so powerful is its psychological depth. It speaks directly to the human experience of being torn between higher and lower impulses, between kindness and cruelty, order and chaos. It externalizes that inner conflict onto a cosmic stage, giving it grandeur and meaning. At the same time, it insists that the struggle is not hopeless. Every choice, no matter how small, is part of the great battle for the universe's destiny. Today, in a world still haunted by conflict, inequality, and environmental crisis, Zoroastrian dualism feels strikingly relevant. It reminds us that evil is not abstract, but real, present in lies, greed, and destruction. Yet it also reminds us that good is stronger, and that our actions, however small, contribute to the world's future. It is a worldview of both responsibility and hope. The story of Zoroastrian dualism is the story of humanity itself, caught between light and darkness, striving for truth in a world of deception, and holding on to the hope that one day good will triumph. Though the fires of Zoroastrian temples now burn in fewer places, their flame continues to illuminate the paths of countless traditions, whispering the ancient truth that the struggle between good and evil is not only cosmic, it is within each of us.